Welcome to Snooze Stories, where history becomes a gentle companion for your journey into sleep. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,000 years to walk alongside one of the most remarkable figures the ancient world ever knew. A man whose name still echoes through the corridors of military academies, whose strategies are still studied, whose audacity still astonishes. Tonight, we meet Hannibal Barca. Hannibal Barca. The name alone conjures images of elephants crossing snow-covered mountains, of impossible journeys and brilliant battles, of a general who brought Rome itself to the brink of destruction. But who was this man, really? Not just the legend, not just the marble bust in a museum, but the living, breathing person who walked the earth, who felt the sun on his face and the weight of enormous responsibility on his shoulders. He was born into a world of conflict, raised by a father who taught him that Rome was the enemy before he could fully understand what that meant. He was a boy who became a soldier who became a commander who became something more, a symbol of resistance, of brilliance, of what one determined soul could achieve against overwhelming odds. Before we journey together through his remarkable life, if you enjoy these historical stories and find comfort in these quiet explorations of the past, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures you'd like to hear about as you drift off to sleep, leave a comment below. Tonight, we will follow Hannibal's story from beginning to end, from the shores of ancient Carthage to the peaks of the Alps, from his greatest triumphs on Italian soil to his final, quiet defeat in a land far from home. We will move slowly, gently, through the decades of his extraordinary life, and perhaps, as we do, you will feel yourself drifting, the ancient world becoming a soft backdrop to your dreams. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. There is no rush here, no urgency. We have all the time we need to explore this life, this legend, this man who refused to surrender even when the whole world told him he should. Let us begin where all stories must begin, at the very beginning, in a world that no longer exists, but whose echoes still shape our own.
To understand Hannibal, we must first understand the city that shaped him, Carthage. Even the name sounds ancient, doesn't it? A whisper from a civilization that rose and fell so long ago that almost nothing remains of it now except stories and ruins and the memories recorded by its enemies. Carthage stood on the North African coast in what is now Tunisia, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It was founded, according to legend, by a Phoenician princess named Dido, who fled her homeland of Tyre after her brother murdered her husband. The story goes that when she arrived on the African shore, she negotiated with the local inhabitants for land, as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. Clever Dido cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips and used them to encircle a large area of coastline. There she built her city. Whether the story is true hardly matters now. What matters is that Carthage grew and grew and grew. By the time Hannibal was born, it was one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the entire Mediterranean world. Its harbors were marvels of engineering, circular military ports that could house hundreds of warships, protected by massive walls, hidden from enemy eyes. Merchant vessels arrived daily from every corner of the known world, carrying grain from Sicily, silver from Iberia, ivory from Africa, purple dye from Phoenicia, tin from distant Britain. The Carthaginians were traders first, warriors second. While Rome was building its power through conquest and the incorporation of Italian peoples into its growing republic, Carthage built its empire through commerce and naval dominance. Carthaginian merchants sailed routes that Roman sailors feared. They ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, into the vast Atlantic, down the coast of Africa, perhaps even as far as the equator. They traded with peoples whose names we will never know, in languages that have been silent for millennia. But wealth breeds envy, and power breeds conflict. And across the sea, on the Italian peninsula, another power was rising: Rome. In the beginning, there was little reason for Carthage and Rome to quarrel. Their spheres of influence barely overlapped. Rome was expanding through Italy, consolidating its control over the various tribes and cities of that peninsula. Carthage controlled North Africa, southern Iberia, Sardinia, Corsica, and the western portion of Sicily. The Mediterranean seemed large enough for both. But then came the spark. A small conflict, really, in the grand scheme of things. A group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines seized control of the city of Messana in Sicily. When the Syracusans tried to reclaim the city, the Mamertines asked for help. Some turned to Carthage, some to Rome. Both powers answered the call, and suddenly, almost by accident, Rome and Carthage found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict. The year was 264 years before the birth of Christ. The First Punic War had begun. Punic, that's what the Romans called the Carthaginians, derived from the Latin word for Phoenician, punicus. It's the only name that survived for these conflicts, because Rome won and Rome wrote the history. The Carthaginians surely had their own name for these wars, their own perspective, their own stories of heroism and loss. But those stories are lost now, filtered through the writings of their enemies, like looking at someone through a mirror that distorts everything it reflects. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. 23 years of brutal, grinding conflict, fought primarily at sea and in Sicily. At first, Carthage had every advantage. Their navy was legendary, the sailors experienced, their warships superior in every way. Rome barely had a navy at all. But Rome learned. They captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, took it apart, studied it, and built copies. Hundreds of copies. Within months, Rome had a fleet, and they innovated, developing a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a heavy spike on the end. When a Roman ship came alongside a Carthaginian vessel, the corvus would slam down, spike into the enemy deck, and suddenly the sea battle became a land battle. Roman soldiers poured across the bridge, and the superior Roman infantry overwhelmed the Carthaginian sailors. The war seesawed back and forth. Great naval battles, devastating storms that destroyed entire fleets, sieges that lasted years. Both sides exhausted themselves. Both sides lost tens of thousands of men. But slowly, painfully, Rome gained the upper hand.
The final blow came at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE. The Roman fleet, under the command of Gaius Lutatius Catulus, caught the Carthaginian fleet by surprise. The Carthaginian ships were loaded down with supplies for their armies in Sicily, making them slow and difficult to maneuver. The Romans attacked at dawn, ramming and sinking ship after ship. The Carthaginian admiral, Hanno, had no choice but to retreat. It was over. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage had to abandon Sicily entirely, pay a massive indemnity to Rome, 3,200 talents of silver to be paid over 10 years. It was a staggering sum, enough to cripple the Carthaginian treasury, and it was humiliating. But the humiliation wasn't finished. While Carthage was still reeling from its defeat, struggling to maintain control over its own affairs, Rome struck again. Sardinia and Corsica, islands that had been Carthaginian for generations, were seized by Rome on the flimsiest of pretexts. When Carthage protested, Rome threatened renewed war unless Carthage paid an additional 1,200 talents and surrendered both islands. Carthage had no choice. Exhausted, bankrupt, defeated, they agreed. They gave up the islands, they paid the silver, and they swallowed their rage. This was the world into which Hannibal Barca was born. A world of defeat and humiliation, of a proud empire brought low, of debts that seemed impossible to repay, and losses that cut deep into the Carthaginian soul. But not everyone in Carthage accepted this defeat quietly. Not everyone was willing to bow before Rome forever. There was one family in particular, one lineage of soldiers and leaders who refused to forget what had been taken from them. They were called the Barcids, and they would change the course of history. At the head of this family stood a man named Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father. Hamilcar was already a legend by the time the First Punic War ended. He had been one of Carthage's most successful generals during the conflict, conducting a brilliant guerrilla campaign in Sicily that frustrated the Romans for years. Even after Carthage's defeat at sea, even when the war was clearly lost, Hamilcar continued fighting, refusing to surrender, forcing Rome to negotiate rather than simply dictate terms. The surname Barca, it meant lightning in the Punic language, and Hamilcar lived up to that name. He was swift, unpredictable, fierce. He struck where his enemies least expected, vanished before they could respond, appeared again somewhere else entirely. The Roman commanders in Sicily grew to hate him, and perhaps, grudgingly, to respect him. When peace finally came, Hamilcar was one of the few Carthaginian leaders who emerged with his reputation intact. He had not lost, he had simply been betrayed by circumstances beyond his control, by the destruction of the Carthaginian fleet, by the exhaustion of the Carthaginian treasury, by politicians in Carthage who chose peace over continued resistance. But Hamilcar did not forget, and he did not forgive. After the war, Carthage faced a new crisis. The mercenaries who had fought for Carthage in Sicily, men from Libya, Iberia, Gaul, Greece, all manner of lands, had not been paid. When they demanded their wages, the Carthaginian government, already bankrupted by the Roman indemnity, tried to negotiate reduced payments. The mercenaries rebelled. What followed was a nightmare. The Mercenary War, also called the Truceless War, was a conflict of astonishing brutality. The mercenaries besieged Carthage itself, cutting off food supplies, crucifying prisoners. Carthage teetered on the brink of complete destruction. Rome watched with interest, pleased to see their defeated enemies suffering even more. It was Hamilcar Barca who saved Carthage. He took command of the Carthaginian forces and through a combination of brilliant tactics and ruthless determination defeated the mercenaries piece by piece. He showed no mercy. Prisoners were executed. Rebellious cities were destroyed. After 3 years of savage fighting, the rebellion was crushed. Hamilcar emerged from this conflict as the most powerful man in Carthage. He had saved the city when all seemed lost, and now he had a vision for how Carthage could recover, how it could rebuild its strength, how it could one day, perhaps, settle the score with Rome.
He looked westward, to Iberia, the land we now call Spain. Iberia was rich, fabulously rich. Its mines produced silver in quantities that could dwarf even the Roman indemnity. Its lands were fertile. Its people were fierce warriors who, if properly led, could form the core of a new Carthaginian army. Iberia could be Carthage's salvation. And so Hamilcar went to Iberia. He brought his family with him, including his young son, a boy not yet 10 years old, a boy named Hannibal. This was the world Hannibal was born into, a world of loss and ambition, of a father who refused to accept defeat, of a city that had been humbled but not broken. The Mediterranean in the 3rd century before Christ was a world of empires in collision, of old powers fading and new powers rising, of endless war masked by temporary peace. Hannibal would grow up in this world. He would be shaped by it, hardened by it, transformed by it into something extraordinary. But that transformation had not yet begun. He was still just a child, living in the shadow of his father's rage, not yet understanding the role he would one day play in the greatest conflict of the ancient world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us slow down. Let us return to the beginning, to the boy himself, to the moment when his life's purpose was sealed with an oath sworn before the gods. Let us meet young Hannibal Barca. The year was 247 BCE. The First Punic War was grinding toward its bitter conclusion, though no one yet knew that peace was only 6 years away. In Carthage, in a household of wealth and influence, a child was born, the first son of Hamilcar Barca and his wife, whose name history has not preserved for us.
They named the boy Hannibal. The name meant grace of Baal, or Baal is gracious, in the Punic tongue. Baal was one of the chief deities of the Carthaginian pantheon, a god of storms and fertility, of power and protection. To name a child after Baal's favor was to ask for blessing, to hope that the divine would watch over this small, fragile life and guide it toward greatness. The gods, it seems, were listening. We know almost nothing of Hannibal's very early years. The ancient sources that tell us of his life, primarily Roman historians writing generations after his death, had little interest in the mundane details of childhood. We don't know what games he played, what his first words were, whether he was a quiet child or a boisterous one. These intimate moments are lost to time. But we can imagine what it must have been like growing up in Carthage during those years. The city was still magnificent, still wealthy, its streets bustling with merchants from a dozen lands, its temples grand and imposing, its harbors filled with ships. But beneath the surface, there was anxiety. The war was not going well. News arrived of defeats at sea, of battles lost, of Rome's growing strength. There must have been conversations in the Barcid household, worried discussions between adults that young Hannibal overheard but didn't fully understand. He would have grown up speaking Punic, the language of Carthage, though he likely learned Greek as well, as many educated Carthaginians did. Greek was the language of culture and learning, the language of Homer's epics and Plato's philosophy. The Carthaginian elite prided themselves on their sophistication, their ability to move between the Semitic world of their Phoenician ancestors and the Hellenic world that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean. When Hannibal was 6 years old, the war ended. Carthage was defeated. The news must have spread through the city like a cold wind, the terms of the peace, the indemnity, the loss of Sicily. In the Barcid household, we can imagine young Hannibal watching his father's face, seeing an expression he had never seen before. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but something harder and colder. Determination, perhaps, resolve. The years that followed were chaotic. The mercenary war erupted when Hannibal was 7, turning the lands around Carthage into a battlefield. The city itself was besieged. Food grew scarce. There may have been days when young Hannibal went to bed hungry, when the sounds of distant fighting echoed across the walls, when his mother held him close and whispered reassurances that she herself might not have believed. And through it all, his father fought. Hamilcar was away for long stretches, commanding armies, crushing rebellions, saving Carthage from destruction. When he returned home, he must have seemed like a god to young Hannibal, this man who could make armies obey, who could turn defeat into victory, who refused to bow before any enemy. Hamilcar had other children as well. Hasdrubal, Hannibal's younger brother, was born during these years, and later another boy named Mago. There were daughters too, though their names come to us only in fragments. But Hannibal was the eldest son, the heir to the Barcid name, and his father had plans for him. When the mercenary war finally ended, when Carthage was secure again, Hamilcar prepared for his expedition to Iberia. He would take an army across the sea, conquer new lands, establish a new base of Carthaginian power far from Rome's reach, and he would take his family with him. It was then, according to the historian Polybius, that one of the most famous moments in Hannibal's life occurred. He would have been 9 years old, perhaps a few months shy of his 10th birthday. A boy on the cusp of adolescence, old enough to understand what was being asked of him, but still young enough to be shaped, molded, turned into whatever his father wished him to become. The story goes like this. Hamilcar was preparing to sacrifice to the gods before his departure to Iberia. This was customary. You did not undertake a great venture without seeking divine favor. The sacrifice would have taken place at one of Carthage's great temples, perhaps the temple of Baal Haman himself, the chief god of the Carthaginian pantheon. The air would have been thick with incense, the floor stained with the blood of animals offered to the gods. Young Hannibal watched his father perform the rituals, fascinated by the solemnity of it all. And then, seized by a child's eagerness, he begged his father to take him along on the expedition. He wanted to go to Iberia, to see new lands, to be part of this grand adventure. Hamilcar looked at his son. We can imagine the calculation in his eyes, the assessment. This boy would be useful in Iberia. He could begin his education in warfare, learn the arts of command and strategy, grow up among soldiers and become a soldier himself. But more than that, Hamilcar saw an opportunity to bind his son to the cause that consumed him, to ensure that the hatred he felt toward Rome would not die with him, but would live on in the next generation. He agreed to take Hannibal. But first, there was a condition. Hamilcar led his son to the altar. He instructed the boy to place his hand on the sacrificial victim. Some sources say it was a bull, others are less specific. The animal's blood was still warm, still flowing, and there, with the gods as witnesses, Hamilcar made his son swear an oath. The exact words of that oath have been debated by historians for centuries. The most common version, recorded by the Roman historian Livy, says that Hannibal swore never to be a friend to Rome. Other sources suggest the oath was more aggressive, that Hannibal promised eternal enmity, that he would make Rome his enemy for as long as he lived. But whatever the precise wording, the meaning was clear. Hamilcar was binding his son to a vendetta, sealing a 9-year-old boy's fate with a vow that would shape the rest of his life. Hannibal would not be allowed to forget what Rome had done to Carthage. He would not be allowed to make peace, to reconcile, to let old grievances fade. He was being forged into a weapon, aimed at the heart of the Roman Republic. Did young Hannibal understand what he was promising? Did he grasp the weight of the oath he was swearing, the way it would define him, constrain him, drive him toward a destiny he could not escape? Or was he simply a boy, eager to please his father, excited by the drama of the moment, repeating words without fully comprehending their meaning? We cannot know, but Hannibal himself, decades later, when he was an old man in exile, would recall this moment. He would tell the story to a Seleucid king, explaining how his hatred of Rome had been planted in him when he was still a child, how it had grown with him, shaped him, become inseparable from his very identity. The oath was sworn, and Hamilcar took his son to Iberia.
The journey itself must have been an adventure for young Hannibal, leaving the only home he had ever known, boarding a ship, crossing the sea to a new land. Iberia in the 3rd century BCE was wild, untamed, a patchwork of Celtic and Iberian tribes who fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. The landscape was dramatic. High mountains, deep valleys, rivers that ran silver with the precious metal that gave them their name. Hamilcar didn't conquer Iberia all at once. He negotiated, made alliances, played tribes against each other, and when necessary, crushed resistance with overwhelming force. Slowly, methodically, he built a new Carthaginian empire in Iberia, centered on the silver mines that would fund Carthage's recovery. And through it all, Hannibal watched and learned. His education was not the education of a typical Carthaginian aristocrat. He wasn't sitting in comfortable rooms studying Greek philosophy and rhetoric, learning the arts of commerce and diplomacy. Instead, he was in army camps, watching his father maneuver troops, plan campaigns, interrogate prisoners, reward allies, and punish traitors. He learned how to read terrain, how to judge distances, how to assess an enemy's strength and find their weaknesses. He learned how to manage logistics, the unglamorous but essential work of keeping an army fed, watered, equipped, and healthy. He learned a dozen languages and dialects, enough to speak with the various peoples who made up his father's army. He learned to ride, to fight, to endure discomfort and hardship without complaint. But perhaps most importantly, he learned his father's hatred. He absorbed it, internalized it, made it his own. Every story Hamilcar told about the First Punic War, every bitter reference to Rome's treachery, every mention of the humiliating peace terms, these were lessons too, teaching Hannibal that Rome was not just an enemy, but the enemy, the great obstacle that stood between Carthage and its rightful place in the world. The ancient historians describe Hannibal as a remarkable young man. He was fearless in combat, first to enter battle and last to leave. He could endure heat and cold, hunger and thirst with equal indifference. He slept on the ground among his soldiers, wrapped in a simple military cloak. He ate the same rations they ate. He was, in short, everything a soldier should be. But he was also intelligent, educated, thoughtful. He could quote Greek poetry. He could discuss strategy and philosophy. He had a Greek tutor named Sosilas who traveled with the army and taught him literature and history. Hannibal was not just a warrior, but a thinker, a student of the art of war who understood that victory came from the mind as much as from the sword. For 9 years, Hamilcar campaigned in Iberia. For 9 years, Hannibal followed him, growing from a boy into a young man, absorbing everything his father could teach him. The Carthaginian presence in Iberia grew stronger each year. Cities were founded, fortifications built, alliances forged. The silver flowed back to Carthage, helping to pay off the Roman indemnity, restoring some measure of prosperity to the battered city. And then, suddenly, it ended. The year was 229 or 228 BCE. The exact date is uncertain. Hamilcar was campaigning against a tribe in the interior of Iberia. There was a battle, or perhaps a siege. The sources are unclear. What is clear is that Hannibal Barca died. Some accounts say he drowned trying to cross a river while retreating from an ambush. Others suggest he died in battle, cut down by enemy warriors.
However it happened, the lightning that was Hamilcar Barca was extinguished. The man who had defined Carthaginian resistance to Rome, who had saved his city from mercenary rebellion, who had built a new empire in Iberia, was gone. Hannibal was 18 years old when his father died. Old enough to be a soldier, not yet old enough to command. The grief must have been overwhelming. Hamilcar had been not just his father, but his teacher, his model, the central figure in his entire life. Everything Hannibal knew, everything he was, had been shaped by Hamilcar's vision. But the work could not stop. Iberia could not be allowed to collapse back into chaos. The Carthaginian cause could not be abandoned. Command of the Iberian forces passed to Hamilcar's son-in-law, a man named Hasdrubal the Fair, called Fair to distinguish him from Hannibal's brother of the same name. Hasdrubal had been one of Hamilcar's most trusted lieutenants, and he continued the work of consolidating Carthaginian control over Iberia. He was a skilled diplomat as well as a soldier, and under his leadership, the Carthaginian position grew even stronger. And Hannibal? Hannibal served under Hasdrubal, learning yet more, gaining experience, proving himself in countless small engagements and skirmishes. He was patient. He did not demand command before he was ready. He watched, and he waited, and he prepared himself for the role he knew would one day be his. The soldiers loved him. They saw in him echoes of his father, the same courage, the same refusal to ask of them anything he wouldn't do himself, the same brilliant tactical mind. But they also saw something more. Where Hamilcar had been fierce and unyielding, Hannibal had a touch of warmth. He knew his men's names, he joked with them, he shared their hardships not out of duty, but out of genuine solidarity. He was becoming, even then, the kind of leader who could inspire men to follow him anywhere, even across the Alps, even into the heart of enemy territory, with no hope of reinforcement and no promise of return. But that was still in the future. For now, Hannibal was simply a young officer in the Carthaginian army in Iberia, serving under his brother-in-law, honoring his father's memory, and carrying within him an oath sworn when he was 9 years old, an oath that would soon shake the ancient world to its foundations. The years passed quietly in Iberia, quietly at least by the standards of the ancient world, where peace was always fragile and war was never far away. Under Hasdrubal the Fair's leadership, the Carthaginian position in Iberia continued to strengthen. More tribes were brought into alliance, either through diplomacy or force. More silver flowed from the mines. More soldiers were trained and equipped. And Hannibal grew into his full strength and capability. He would have been in his early 20s during these years, serving as one of Hasdrubal's senior officers. We can imagine him leading cavalry units on patrol, negotiating with tribal chieftains, overseeing the training of new recruits, managing the complex logistics of an army operating far from home. Every day brought new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to prove himself. The ancient sources tell us that Hannibal was immediately recognizable, even in a crowd of soldiers. There was something in his bearing, in the way he carried himself, that marked him as different. He dressed simply, wearing the same armor as his men, but there was a natural authority about him that drew people's attention. When he spoke, people listened. When he gave orders, they were obeyed, not just out of duty, but out of respect. He had his father's strategic brilliance, but he tempered it with something Hamilcar had perhaps lacked, a genuine affection for the men who served under him. Hannibal understood that an army was not just a tool, a weapon to be wielded, but a collection of human beings, each with their own fears and hopes and loyalties. He cultivated those loyalties carefully, deliberately, knowing that the bonds between a commander and his soldiers could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But Hannibal was not the only young leader rising to prominence in Iberia. Hasdrubal the Fair had his own vision for Carthaginian power, and it was more cautious, more diplomatic than Hamilcar's had been. Where Hamilcar had been aggressive, always pushing for expansion, Hasdrubal preferred to consolidate what had already been gained. He negotiated a treaty with Rome, establishing the Ebro River as the northern boundary of Carthaginian influence in Iberia. Rome agreed not to expand south of the Ebro, and Carthage agreed not to expand north of it. It was a sensible arrangement, the kind of pragmatic compromise that could have prevented war, but it also went against everything Hamilcar had stood for, everything he had taught his son. Hannibal must have watched this treaty being negotiated with mixed feelings. He was disciplined enough, loyal enough not to challenge Hasdrubal's authority, but in his heart he must have remembered his oath, remembered his father's hatred of Rome, and wondered when the time would come to act on it. The answer came sooner than anyone expected. In the year 221 BCE, Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated. The killer was a Celtic slave seeking revenge for some personal grievance. The exact details are lost to history, but the result was clear. The man who had led the Carthaginian forces in Iberia for 8 years was dead, killed by a single blade in a moment of violence. The question of succession arose immediately. Who would command the army now? Who would govern the Carthaginian territories in Iberia? The soldiers answered that question themselves. They acclaimed Hannibal as their new commander, not through any formal process, not through appointment by the Carthaginian Senate, but through a spontaneous, unanimous declaration of loyalty. The army wanted Hannibal, and what the army wanted, it tended to get. The Carthaginian government in Africa, faced with this fait accompli, had little choice but to ratify the army's decision. Hannibal Barca, 26 years old, became the supreme commander of Carthaginian forces in Iberia.
It's worth pausing here to consider how remarkable this was. 26 is young for such responsibility, even in a world where people aged and died much faster than they do now. Hannibal had never held independent command before. He had never governed a territory, never negotiated treaties, never made the kinds of strategic decisions that could determine the fate of nations. But he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Everything his father had taught him, everything he had learned from Hasdrubal, every battle he had fought and every negotiation he had observed, it had all been building toward this. He was ready, and he had a plan. For the next 2 years, Hannibal campaigned aggressively in Iberia. He expanded Carthaginian control into regions that had remained independent, subduing tribes that had resisted his predecessors. He was proving himself, demonstrating to his soldiers and to the government in Carthage that their faith in him was justified. But he was also preparing, building up his forces, training his army, testing new tactics and strategies. He was getting ready for the war he knew was coming, the war he intended to provoke. There was a city on the eastern coast of Iberia called Saguntum. It stood south of the Ebro River, technically within the Carthaginian sphere of influence according to Hasdrubal's treaty with Rome. But Saguntum had an alliance with Rome, an old agreement that predated the Ebro Treaty. The Saguntines considered themselves under Roman protection, and Rome, though far away, had promised to defend them if necessary. Saguntum was prosperous, strategically located, and, most importantly for Hannibal's purposes, the perfect provocation. If he attacked Saguntum, Rome would have to respond, and if Rome responded, Hannibal would have his war. In the spring of 219 BCE, Hannibal marched his army to Saguntum and laid siege to the city. The siege was brutal and prolonged. Saguntum was well fortified, its walls strong, its defenders determined. They knew what would happen if the city fell, and they fought with the desperation of people who had everything to lose. Hannibal threw his forces against those walls again and again, accepting heavy casualties, driving his men forward with relentless determination. He was wounded during the siege, a spear thrust to the thigh that laid him up for days. But even injured, he directed the assault, refusing to abandon the operation or show any weakness. The message to his soldiers was clear: nothing would stop him. Not injury, not setbacks, not the possibility of Roman intervention. Saguntum would fall. And it did. After 8 months of siege, after starvation had reduced the defenders to eating leather and worse, after the walls had been breached and the end was inevitable, Saguntum surrendered. The city was sacked, its wealth distributed among Hannibal's troops, its people sold into slavery or killed. It was a demonstration of what Hannibal was capable of, a showing of force and will that echoed across the Mediterranean. But more than that, it was a declaration. Hannibal was telling Rome in the clearest possible terms that he did not fear them, that he would not be bound by their treaties or intimidated by their power. Rome's response was exactly what Hannibal had anticipated. Ambassadors were sent to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over to Roman justice for violating their alliance with Saguntum. The Carthaginian Senate was divided. Some, perhaps remembering the catastrophic costs of the First Punic War, wanted to comply, wanted to avoid another devastating conflict. Others, particularly those aligned with the Barcid family, supported Hannibal.
The debate must have been heated, urgent, filled with arguments about honor and pragmatism, about whether Carthage should stand with its most successful general or appease Rome to preserve peace. In the end, Carthage refused Rome's demand. They would not surrender Hannibal. They stood by their general, by the Barcid vision of a Carthage that did not bow before Roman threats. The Roman ambassadors, according to legend, made one final dramatic gesture. The leader of the delegation, a senator named Quintus Fabius, held out the folds of his toga and said to the Carthaginian Senate, "In these folds I carry both peace and war. Which shall I give you?" The Carthaginian response was defiant. "Whichever you please." Fabius let the folds of his toga fall open. "That I give you war." And war it would be. The Second Punic War had begun. But this would not be like the First Punic War, a grinding naval conflict fought over Sicily. Hannibal had no intention of waiting for Roman armies to cross the sea to Africa or to attack Carthaginian positions in Iberia. He had studied Rome's strengths and weaknesses. He understood that Rome's power came from the Italian Confederation, from the network of allies and subject peoples who provided the legions with an almost inexhaustible supply of manpower. If you wanted to defeat Rome, you couldn't do it across the sea. You had to strike at the heart.
You had to go to Italy itself, break Rome's alliances, show the Italian peoples that Rome was not invincible, that there was an alternative to Roman domination. You had to do what no one thought was possible. You had to march an army from Iberia to Italy, overland, through hostile territory, across the highest mountains in Europe. You had to cross the Alps. When Hannibal announced his plan to his officers, they must have thought he was mad. The Alps in late autumn, with snow already falling on the peaks, with an army of tens of thousands of men, with cavalry and supply trains and war elephants, it was impossible. It had never been done, not on this scale, not with a force large enough to threaten Rome. But Hannibal was not interested in what had never been done. He was interested in what needed to be done, and he believed with absolute certainty that it could be accomplished. He spent the winter of 219 to 218 BCE preparing. Supplies were gathered, routes were scouted as much as possible. Alliances were negotiated with Gallic tribes in southern Gaul who hated Rome and might be willing to help a Carthaginian army pass through their lands. Hannibal sent agents ahead, bribing chieftains, gathering intelligence, smoothing the way for the march to come. And he drilled his army relentlessly. They needed to be in peak condition for what lay ahead. They needed to be able to march long distances, to fight when exhausted, to endure hardships that would break lesser men. Hannibal pushed them hard, but he also inspired them. He painted a vision of what they could achieve together: the conquest of Italy, the humiliation of Rome, glory and wealth beyond imagining. His army was diverse, drawn from across the Carthaginian world. There were Libyans and Numidians from Africa, Iberians from the local tribes, Balearic slingers famous for their accuracy, Gallic mercenaries, cavalry from a dozen different peoples. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, came from vastly different cultures, but Hannibal welded them into a unified force, bound together by loyalty to him and by the promise of victory. In the spring of 218 BCE, everything was ready. Hannibal gathered his forces. Ancient sources suggest somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 or 38 war elephants. The exact numbers are disputed, but the scale was enormous. He left his brother Hasdrubal in command of Iberia with a substantial garrison to hold the territory against any Roman attack from the sea. He sent another force to Africa to protect Carthage itself, and then, with the remaining army, he began his march, north from Iberia, toward the Pyrenees, toward Gaul, toward the Alps, toward Italy, toward Rome. The soldiers must have looked back as they marched away from their bases, from the cities and camps that had been their homes for years. Many of them would never see Iberia again. Many would never see their families again. But they followed Hannibal anyway, trusting in his genius, believing in his vision, willing to follow him into the unknown. Hannibal rode at the head of the column, 29 years old, carrying the weight of his father's expectations and his own oath. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. The war he had been born to fight was finally beginning, and the world would never be the same.
Let us pause for a moment and consider what Hannibal was attempting. Imagine you are standing in Iberia in the spring of 218 BCE, looking at a map, though maps then were nothing like the precise instruments we have today. You can see the basic geography: Iberia to the west, Italy to the east, and between them the vast expanse of southern Gaul and the towering barrier of the Alps. No one had ever marched an army of this size from Iberia to Italy. Trade caravans made the journey, yes. Small groups of travelers, merchants, individual soldiers, they could navigate the route. But an army of tens of thousands, with cavalry, with siege equipment, with elephants? It seemed impossible. And that, perhaps, was exactly why Hannibal believed it would work. Rome would not expect it. They would assume any Carthaginian attack would come by sea, as it had in the First Punic War. They would position their forces accordingly, preparing to defend the coasts, to intercept Carthaginian fleets. They would not be watching the northern mountain passes, not carefully, not in sufficient force.
Surprise would be Hannibal's first weapon, but surprise alone would not be enough. The journey itself was the challenge, the enormous logistical and physical undertaking that would test everything he had learned about leadership and strategy. The army that assembled for this march was unlike any other in the ancient world. Hannibal had spent years building it, training it, forging it into an instrument capable of the impossible. Let us look closely at who these people were, these soldiers who would follow Hannibal into legend. At the core were the African troops, Libyan infantry armed with long spears and large shields, veterans of countless campaigns in Iberia, disciplined and reliable. These men formed the heavy infantry, the solid center of Hannibal's battle line. They wore bronze armor, helmets fashioned in various styles, and they fought in close formation, a wall of shields and spear points that could hold against almost any assault. Then there were the Numidian cavalry, perhaps the finest light horsemen in the entire Mediterranean world. The Numidians came from the lands west of Carthage, desert peoples who seemed to be born on horseback. They rode without saddles or bridles, controlling their mounts with voice and pressure from their legs, leaving their hands free to hurl javelins with devastating accuracy. They could ride circles around heavier cavalry, peppering them with missiles, then vanishing before the enemy could respond. Hannibal's father had employed Numidian cavalry to great effect, and Hannibal had learned to use them as a scalpel, precise and deadly. The Iberian contingent was large and varied. Some were heavy infantry, armed similarly to the Libyans, wearing distinctive white tunics with purple borders. Others were lighter troops, wielding the falcata, a curved sword unique to Iberia, wickedly sharp, capable of cleaving through armor and bone. The Iberians were fierce, proud, loyal to Hannibal personally rather than to distant Carthage. Many had served under his father, and they saw in Hannibal the continuation of the Barcid promise: wealth, glory, and revenge against Rome. From the Balearic Islands came the slingers, men who could launch stones or lead bullets with incredible force and accuracy. A skilled slinger could kill at 100 paces, could strike a specific target, a man's head, the eye slit of a helmet, with frightening consistency. They were lightly equipped, wearing little armor, relying on distance and accuracy rather than close combat. And then there were the Gauls, Celtic warriors from tribes in northern Iberia and southern Gaul, big men with fierce mustaches and long hair, who fought with wild courage and individual prowess. They were less disciplined than the African troops, more prone to breaking formation in the heat of battle, but their ferocity was unmatched. They wielded long slashing swords and carried tall shields, and they often fought bare-chested, disdaining armor, believing that courage was protection enough. The cavalry was similarly diverse. Besides the Numidians, there were Iberian horsemen, Gallic cavalry, and squadrons of heavier cavalry from Africa and Carthage itself. All told, Hannibal commanded perhaps 12,000 mounted warriors, an enormous cavalry force by the standards of the time. And then there were the elephants. 37 or 38 of them. Sources disagree on the exact count. These were North African forest elephants, smaller than the Asian elephants we know today, but still massive, terrifying, unlike anything most people in the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. Elephants were psychological weapons as much as physical ones. Horses, unless specifically trained, would panic at the smell and sight of them. Infantry would break and run rather than face a charging elephant. But they were also difficult to manage, expensive to feed, vulnerable to panic themselves if wounded or frightened. Bringing them across the Pyrenees and the Alps was a staggering logistical challenge. Why did Hannibal insist on bringing them? Partly for their shock value in battle, partly because they were a symbol of Carthaginian power, exotic and impressive, but perhaps also because they represented the audacity of the entire enterprise. If you could bring elephants across the Alps, you could do anything. The march began in late spring. Hannibal moved his massive army north from their bases in Iberia, following the coastal route toward the Pyrenees. The first obstacle was the Pyrenees themselves, that chain of mountains separating Iberia from Gaul. But the Pyrenees, though formidable, were not the Alps. There were established passes, routes that traders had used for generations. The challenge was not the terrain so much as the people who lived there. The mountain tribes of the Pyrenees were fiercely independent, suspicious of lowlanders and their armies. They had to be dealt with carefully. Hannibal did what he did best. He negotiated. He sent envoys ahead with gifts, with promises, with threats when necessary. Some tribes were bribed to allow passage. Others were overawed by the size of Hannibal's army and chose not to resist. A few fought, launching ambushes on the column, rolling rocks down on the marching soldiers, but they were swept aside by Hannibal's veterans. The crossing took time and it cost men. Some fell to enemy action, others to accidents in the treacherous mountain paths, and some simply deserted. When the army emerged on the northern side of the Pyrenees, Hannibal conducted a review and realized he had lost nearly 10,000 men. Some to combat, yes, but many had simply slipped away, Iberian soldiers deciding they had marched far enough from home, that they wanted no part of the madness that lay ahead. Hannibal let them go. He did not want soldiers who lacked the will to continue. Better to have a smaller army of committed men than a larger force riddled with doubters. He gathered those who remained and addressed them, reminding them of what they were fighting for, painting the vision of Italy conquered and Rome humbled. And then they marched on into Gaul. Gaul in the 3rd century BCE was a patchwork of Celtic tribes, some friendly to Carthage, others allied with Rome, most simply concerned with their own affairs and viewing both Mediterranean powers with suspicion. Hannibal's route would take him through the territories of dozens of these tribes, and each one posed potential danger. But Hannibal had prepared for this. For months, perhaps years, he had been sending agents into Gaul, establishing contacts, building relations. He knew which tribal chieftains might be persuaded to support him, which ones hated Rome enough to risk helping a Carthaginian army, which ones could be bought with silver from the Iberian mines. The Gauls had long memories. Rome had been expanding northward into what the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul, the Gallic lands south of the Alps, in the Po River valley of northern Italy. Roman legions had fought Gallic tribes, had seized Gallic land, had established colonies in territory that had been Celtic for centuries. There was deep resentment, a desire for revenge that Hannibal could tap into.
He positioned himself as a liberator, as an enemy of Rome who offered the Gauls a chance to strike back. Some tribes welcomed him enthusiastically, providing guides, supplies, even warriors to supplement his army. Others were more cautious, agreeing to let him pass but offering nothing more. And some were hostile, loyal to Rome, or simply opposed to any foreign army crossing their lands. The march through Gaul was a delicate dance of diplomacy and military prowess. Hannibal would approach a tribal territory and send envoys ahead. If the tribe seemed friendly, he would accept their hospitality, feast with their chieftains, exchange gifts, and reinforce the alliance. If they seemed hostile, he would avoid their territory if possible, or, if necessary, demonstrate his military strength in a quick, decisive engagement that convinced them resistance was futile. The Rhone River posed a significant challenge. It was wide, fast-flowing, and crossing it with an entire army would be a complex operation. When Hannibal arrived at the river, he found a Gaelic tribe called the Volcae massed on the opposite bank, ready to contest the crossing. Hannibal could have forced a crossing directly, accepting heavy casualties in the process. Instead, he demonstrated the tactical flexibility that would characterize his entire campaign. He sent a detachment of troops upriver under cover of night. They crossed at a narrower point, then marched downstream and attacked the Volcae from behind, just as Hannibal launched his main crossing. Caught between two forces, the Volcae broke and fled. The crossing proceeded smoothly, though getting the elephants across the river proved entertaining. Some were ferried across on large rafts covered with earth to make the elephants think they were still on solid ground. Others, in their panic, fell into the river and swam across, using their trunks as snorkels.
their mahouts clinging desperately to their backs. It must have been quite a sight, this vast, diverse army crossing the Rhone, elephants trumpeting, cavalry splashing through the shallows, thousands of men working together to ferry equipment and supplies. The local Gauls watched from a distance, uncertain whether to be awed or terrified by this strange force passing through their lands. After the Rhone, Hannibal turned north, following the river upstream before veering east toward the Alps. He was now in the territory of the Allobroges, another Celtic tribe, and here he faced another complication. The Allobroges were divided. Some factions wanted to help him, others wanted to resist. Hannibal navigated this carefully, eventually securing safe passage by demonstrating both his willingness to negotiate and his capacity for overwhelming force. But time was passing. It was now late summer, verging on early autumn. The Alpine passes would not remain open much longer. Snow would soon begin falling on the higher elevations, and once winter truly set in, the passes would become impassable. Hannibal needed to move quickly. He addressed his army one last time before beginning the ascent into the mountains. We don't know exactly what he said, but the ancient historians suggest he spoke of destiny, of the glory that awaited them, of how they would be remembered forever as the men who did the impossible. He pointed toward the Alps, those massive peaks rising before them, and he told them that beyond those mountains lay Italy, lay Rome's heartland, lay everything they had been fighting for. The soldiers looked at those mountains, at the snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the sky, and they must have felt something between dread and exhilaration. This was the moment. Everything they had endured, the battles in Iberia, the crossing of the Pyrenees, the long march through Gaul, had been preparation for this. Hannibal organized the army for the climb. The most reliable troops were placed at the front and rear of the column. The veterans who could be trusted to handle unexpected attacks were difficult terrain. The baggage train was carefully arranged, with essential supplies given priority. The elephants were distributed throughout the column, their handlers working to keep the massive beasts calm and moving forward.
And then they began to climb. The foothills were not too difficult, though the paths were narrow and the army had to string itself out in a long, vulnerable column. But as they gained elevation, as the terrain grew steeper and more treacherous, the true difficulty of the undertaking became apparent. The air grew thinner, colder. Men who had spent their lives in the warm climates of Africa and Iberia felt the bite of mountain wind, saw their breath misting in the air, watched snow begin to fall. The paths became treacherous, narrow trails carved into the sides of cliffs with sheer drops on one side and rock walls on the other. And somewhere ahead, in those mountains, hostile tribes waited. Mountain peoples who resented outsiders, who saw this Carthaginian army as invaders, as a threat, as an opportunity for plunder. The worst of the journey was about to begin, but Hannibal pressed on, leading his armies higher and higher into the realm of ice and stone, toward a pass that would take them over the roof of the world and down, finally, into Italy, into the heart of Rome's power, into legend. The Alps. Even today, with modern roads and tunnels, with heated vehicles and weather forecasts, the Alps command respect. They are beautiful and terrible, magnificent and merciless. To cross them on foot in late autumn with an army of tens of thousands, with horses and elephants and supply wagons, it defies comprehension. But Hannibal did not ask his soldiers to comprehend it. He asked them only to follow, one step at a time, higher and higher into those ancient mountains. The early part of the ascent, through the foothills, gave the army a false sense of security. The paths were difficult, yes, but manageable. The locals, the Gaelic tribes who lived in the lower elevations, had agreed to provide guides in exchange for payment.
These guides led the Carthaginian column along trails that wound through valleys, crossed mountain streams, climbed gradually toward the high passes. But Hannibal did not entirely trust these guides. He had learned long ago that trust could be a dangerous luxury. He kept his scouts ranging ahead, his best soldiers alert for any sign of treachery. And his caution proved justified. After several days of climbing, the guides led the army into a narrow valley, a place where the path squeezed between towering cliffs, where a column of marching soldiers would be stretched thin and vulnerable. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and that, Hannibal realized with cold clarity, was exactly what the guides had intended. He halted the column. His officers gathered around him, and he explained his suspicions. The guides protested their innocence, but Hannibal was not interested in their protests. He detained them and sent his most experienced scouts ahead to reconnoiter the valley. They returned with confirmation. The cliffs above the path were lined with warriors from the local tribes, hidden among the rocks, waiting for the Carthaginian army to enter the killing ground below. Once the column was committed to the narrow valley, rocks would rain down, arrows would fly, and the tribesmen would descend from above to finish off whoever survived the initial onslaught. It was a good plan. It might have worked had Hannibal been less cautious or more trusting. Instead, Hannibal adapted. He could not avoid the valley entirely, it was the only route forward and time was running short, but he could control when and how his army passed through it. He waited until nightfall, then sent his baggage train through under cover of darkness with minimal escort. The tribesmen, waiting for the main body of the army, let the baggage pass, not wanting to reveal their positions for such meager prey. Then, at dawn, Hannibal moved his main force through the valley. But he did not march them in column. Instead, he sent light infantry and cavalry up onto the heights, scrambling up the same rocky slopes the tribesmen had used. When the ambush was sprung, when rocks began to tumble down and the mountain warriors revealed themselves, they found not a helpless column, but an organized defense. Hannibal's troops on the heights engaged the ambushers directly. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting on treacherous terrain. Men grappled and stabbed and pushed each other off cliffs. Rocks slipped underfoot. The mountain warriors had the advantage of knowing the ground, but Hannibal's soldiers had superior discipline and equipment. By the time the sun was fully up, the ambush had been broken. The tribesmen fled deeper into the mountains, leaving their dead behind. Hannibal's army continued its march, though the encounter had cost them time and lives. Horses had panicked and plunged off the path, supplies had been lost or damaged, men had been killed or injured by falling rocks. But they had survived, and they pressed on. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped. Men who had never seen snow before watched in wonder as white flakes began to fall, settling on their cloaks and armor. That wonder quickly turned to misery as the cold seeped into their bones, as their fingers grew numb, as their breath came in harsh gasps in the thin mountain air. The elephants suffered terribly. These were creatures of warm climates, of African savannas and forests. The cold was agony for them, and their handlers struggled to keep them moving forward. Some of the beasts began to sicken, their massive bodies shivering, their movements sluggish. The paths grew narrower and more dangerous. In places, the trail was barely wide enough for a single man to pass, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet on one side. The army had to move in single file, each man placing his feet carefully, praying not to slip. Equipment that was too wide for the path had to be disassembled and carried in pieces. The elephants, broad and unwieldy, could barely squeeze through some passages. And still the attacks came. The mountain tribes, having failed at their large-scale ambush, resorted to guerrilla tactics. They would appear suddenly, hurling rocks and javelins, then disappear back into the crags before Hannibal's soldiers could respond. They rolled boulders down from above, aiming for the packed column below. They struck at night, creeping into the Carthaginian camp to steal supplies or kill sentries. Hannibal responded with ruthless efficiency. When his scouts captured some of the raiders, he made examples of them, leaving their bodies displayed as warnings. When his troops identified a village that was harboring the attackers, he had it burned. He could not afford mercy, not here, not when every delay brought them closer to winter, when the passes might close forever and trap his army in these terrible mountains. The nights were the worst. The army would make camp wherever they could find relatively level ground, huddling together for warmth, burning whatever wood they could scavenge. But there was never enough wood, never enough warmth. Men who had campaigned in the heat of Iberia and North Africa woke to find frost on their cloaks, ice in their waterskins. Horses died from the cold and exhaustion. Their bodies were butchered for meat. There was no point in waste, and the army needed food. Some of the pack animals, driven mad by cold and fear, broke free and plunged off the sides of mountains, taking their loads with them. And every morning, Hannibal would be the first one up, walking among his soldiers, speaking words of encouragement, checking on the wounded, ensuring his officers knew the plan for the day. He slept as little as any of them, ate the same rations, endured the same cold. His men saw this, drew strength from it. If Hannibal could endure, so could they. After 9 days of climbing, 9 days that must have felt like 9 years, they reached the summit of the pass. The exact location has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue for the Col de Clapier, others for the Col de Montgenèvre or the Col de Mont-Cenis. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about the precise route, but whichever pass it was, the moment of reaching the top must have been overwhelming. Hannibal called a halt. He gathered his soldiers and pointed downward toward the distant plains of Italy visible through breaks in the clouds. There, he told them, was their goal. There was the land they had come to conquer. Beyond those foothills lay the Po River Valley, rich and fertile. Beyond that lay Rome itself. The soldiers must have stared at that view with a mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the climb was over. Excitement at having made it this far, at being so close to Italy. But also apprehension, because even from here they could see that the descent would be treacherous, perhaps even more dangerous than the ascent. And they were right to be apprehensive. The northern slope of the Alps was steeper than the southern side, and it was already covered in snow and ice. The path, such as it was barely visible under the white blanket. The descent began, and almost immediately the problems multiplied. Men slipped on the ice, sliding down the slope, unable to stop themselves. Some crashed into rocks and were killed. Others slid off the edge of the path and disappeared into crevices or plummeted down cliffs. The elephants were even worse off. Their hooves could find no purchase on the ice, and they fell repeatedly, breaking legs, injuring themselves and the men around them. The elephants, massive and ponderous, moved with excruciating slowness. Their handlers walked ahead of them, testing each step, trying to find the most stable route. But even so, the great beasts slipped and stumbled, their trumpeting cries of distress echoing across the mountains. And then they encountered the landslide. At some point in the recent past, perhaps triggered by the passage of Hannibal's own army, perhaps by natural causes, a section of the mountain slope had given way. The path, such as it was, had been obliterated. In its place was a jumble of rocks and ice and snow, unstable and treacherous with no clear way through. Hannibal surveyed the obstacle. This was, perhaps, the worst moment of the entire crossing. They had come so far. Italy was visible below them, but this blockage threatened to stop them completely. The army could not turn back. They had neither the time nor the supplies. They could not wait for the landslide to somehow clear itself. They had to go forward. He ordered his men to clear a path. For a day and a night, soldiers worked with picks and shovels and bare hands, moving rocks, cutting steps into the ice, trying to create something resembling a passable route. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Men fell from fatigue. Others were struck by falling rocks dislodged from above. But the path they managed to create was still too narrow for the baggage animals and far too narrow for the elephants. It's here that one of the most famous stories of the Alpine crossing occurs. The Roman historian Livy, writing about 200 years after the events, describes how Hannibal's engineers used a technique to widen the path. They built large fires against the rocky slope, heating the stone until it was hot enough to crack. Then they poured vinegar, sour wine really, onto the heated rock. The thermal shock, according to Livy, caused the rock to fracture and crumble, allowing the soldiers to break it apart and clear a wider path. Is this story true? Historians debate it. Some point out that the chemistry is sound. Rapid heating and cooling can indeed fracture rock, and acidic liquid might enhance the effect. Others note that the army was desperately short on supplies by this point, and using precious wine, even sour wine, to break rocks seems wasteful. Perhaps it's a later embellishment, a detail added to make the story more dramatic. But whether the vinegar story is literal truth or symbolic of the ingenuity Hannibal's forces employed, the essential point is clear. They found a way through. By whatever combination of back-breaking labor, engineering skill, and sheer determination, they carved a path through that landslide wide enough for the army to pass. The descent continued. More men died. More horses and pack animals were lost. The elephants, those magnificent beasts that had survived so much, continued to suffer. Some of them collapsed from exhaustion and could not be coaxed to rise again. Their handlers wept as they abandoned the creatures to die in the snow. The army's condition was dire. Men were frostbitten, starving, exhausted beyond endurance. They had been on reduced rations for days. There was no firewood this high up, so they ate cold food or went hungry. Morale was crumbling. Some men simply sat down in the snow and refused to go on, choosing death by freezing over another step along that terrible path. But Hannibal drove them forward, not with cruelty, but with example. He was among them, sharing every hardship, visible and present. When men faltered, he was there, speaking to them, encouraging them, reminding them what they were fighting for. When officers came to him with problems that seemed insurmountable, he listened, then found solutions or ordered them to find solutions themselves. Leadership in those moments was not about grand strategy or brilliant tactics. It was about being present, about refusing to give up, about convincing exhausted, terrified men that the next step was possible, and then the next, and then the next after that. 15 days after they had begun the Alpine crossing, Hannibal's army stumbled out of the mountains and into the foothills of northern Italy. 15 days that had seemed like a lifetime. 15 days that had transformed this army from a confident, well-equipped force into a ragged band of survivors.
When Hannibal called a halt and ordered a count of his forces, the losses were staggering. Of the approximately 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry that had begun the crossing, barely half remained. Perhaps 26,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry had survived. The rest were dead, killed in ambushes, lost to falls and exposure, abandoned when they could no longer march. Of the 37 or 38 elephants that had started the crossing, only about 20 remained. The others had perished in the cold or been left behind when they could no longer move. The survivors were in terrible condition. Many were injured, suffering from frostbite, from untreated wounds, from illness brought on by the cold and exhaustion. Their equipment was damaged or lost. Their supplies were almost completely depleted. They were starving, freezing, and traumatized. But they were in Italy. Hannibal gave his army time to rest, to recover, to absorb what they had accomplished. He led them down into the Po River Valley, into the lands of the Gauls who lived in Cisalpine Gaul, and there they found warmth and food and shelter. The Gallic tribes, who hated Rome for its encroachments into their territory, welcomed Hannibal as a liberator. They provided supplies, guides, and, crucially, reinforcements. Gallic warriors, eager for revenge against Rome, flocked to join Hannibal's army. Slowly, the army began to recover. The men rested, ate proper meals, warmed themselves by fires, tended to their wounds. The horses and surviving elephants were cared for, given fodder and time to regain their strength. New equipment was acquired or manufactured.
The army that had emerged from the Alps as a broken remnant began to resemble a fighting force again, and Hannibal planned his next moves. He had done the impossible. He had brought an army across the Alps in late autumn. He had arrived in Italy, in Rome's heartland, where no one had expected him to be. The element of surprise was complete. Now he needed to exploit it. Roman armies were gathering, of course. News of his arrival had spread quickly, and Rome's initial disbelief had turned to alarm. Legions were being mustered, consuls appointed to lead them, strategies debated in the Senate. But all of this took time, and time was something Hannibal had bought himself through sheer audacity. As he sat in his tent in the Po Valley, warming himself by a fire, planning his campaign, Hannibal must have allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The oath he had sworn as a 9-year-old boy, standing before an altar with his father's hand on his shoulder, was being fulfilled. He had brought war to Rome's doorstep. He had made them fear. The mountains were behind him. Italy lay ahead. And the real war, the war that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean world, was about to begin. His soldiers looked at him with something approaching awe. They had followed him across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, over the Alps. They had endured the impossible because he had asked it of them, because he had shared every hardship, because they believed in him. They would follow him further still, through victories and defeats, through years of campaigning in hostile territory, through glories and sorrows that none of them could yet imagine. But that night, in the Po Valley, with the Alps behind them and Italy before them, they simply rested. They ate and slept and recovered their strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they had earned this moment of peace, this brief respite before the storm. And Hannibal, looking out at the campfires of his army, at the men who had crossed the Alps because he had asked them to, must have felt the weight of what came next settling on his shoulders. The crossing was over. The war had truly begun.
Rome did not yet understand what was coming. Oh, they knew that Hannibal had crossed the Alps. That news had reached the Senate, causing shock and consternation. But they did not yet grasp what kind of enemy they were facing, did not yet comprehend the genius that had brought an army through those mountains. The Romans were confident. Why shouldn't they be? Rome had defeated Carthage in the First Punic War. Rome had the largest manpower reserves in the Mediterranean, an almost inexhaustible supply of soldiers from its Italian allies. Rome had never been conquered, never been invaded successfully. Their legions were disciplined, well-trained, led by consuls who had fought in countless campaigns. What was one Carthaginian general arrived with a battered army compared to the might of Rome? They would learn. But the learning would be painful. The first Roman force to encounter Hannibal was led by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same Scipio who would later father a son of the same name, the Scipio who would eventually defeat Hannibal. But that was years away. In the autumn of 218 BCE, the elder Scipio commanded a consular army that had been intended for Iberia. When news came that Hannibal had crossed into Italy, Scipio rushed north to intercept him. The two armies met near the Ticinus River, a tributary of the Po, in November. It was not a full battle, more of a cavalry engagement, a probing action where both commanders wanted to take the measure of the other. Scipio led his cavalry forward, Roman and Italian horsemen in their glittering armor, confident in their numbers and training. But they had never faced Numidian cavalry before. They had never experienced the fluid, elusive tactics of these desert horsemen who could appear and disappear like ghosts, who threw their javelins with devastating accuracy and then wheeled away before the Romans could close for hand-to-hand combat. The Numidians swarmed around the Roman cavalry, harassing them, wearing them down. And when the Romans were sufficiently disrupted, Hannibal committed his heavier cavalry, Iberian and Gallic horsemen, who crashed into the disordered Roman ranks with overwhelming force. The Roman cavalry broke. They fled back toward their lines, and in the chaos, Consul Scipio himself was wounded, struck by a javelin that pierced his side. He would have been killed, might have been captured, but his teenage son, young Publius Cornelius Scipio, the future Scipio Africanus, allegedly charged forward with a handful of companions and rescued his father, driving off the Carthaginian pursuers. It was a small engagement, as battles go, but its psychological impact was enormous. The Romans had met Hannibal in the field and been defeated. A consul had been wounded. The vaunted Roman cavalry had been scattered like leaves before a storm. Scipio withdrew his army south of the Po, seeking a defensive position where he could regroup and wait for reinforcements. He sent urgent messages to Rome, explaining that this Carthaginian general was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated.
Rome responded by recalling the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who had been campaigning in Sicily. Longus was ordered to bring his legions north immediately, to combine forces with Scipio and crush this Carthaginian upstart before winter set in. But Hannibal was not idle. He continued his march through the Po Valley, and everywhere he went, the Gallic tribes rallied to him. The Gauls of northern Italy had been fighting Rome for generations, resenting the Roman colonies planted in their lands, the Roman roads that cut through their territories, the Roman legions that enforced Roman law. Now here was a foreign general offering them a chance for revenge. Warriors flocked to Hannibal's banner. His army, so depleted by the Alpine crossing, began to grow again. Not to its original size, the losses in the mountains could never be fully replaced, but enough to make it a formidable fighting force. The Gallic warriors were fierce, if undisciplined, and their knowledge of the local terrain was invaluable. Hannibal understood the importance of these alliances. He treated the Gallic chieftains with respect, honored their customs, distributed plunder generously. He was fighting a psychological war as much as a physical one. Every tribe that joined him was a tribe that Rome lost. Every victory he won was proof that Rome could be beaten, that the Italian Confederation could be broken. By December, Consul Longus had arrived with his legions. The two consular armies combined near the Trebia River, creating a force of roughly 40,000 men, 4 Roman legions, plus supporting Italian allies. It was a powerful army, confident and eager for battle. Longus, in particular, was keen to engage Hannibal before his co-consul Scipio could heal from his wounds. Longus wanted the glory of defeating Hannibal for himself. Hannibal watched the Roman camp from a distance and began to plan. He understood Roman psychology, understood the competitive nature of their dual consulship system, where 2 generals shared command and often competed for honor. He understood that Longus was eager, perhaps too eager, and he prepared to exploit that eagerness. The terrain near the Trebia was favorable for Hannibal's purposes. There was a small river to cross, not terribly deep, but cold. It was December, and winter had set in. Beyond the river was a flat plain, good ground for cavalry, and along one side of that plain was a series of gullies and ravines overgrown with brush, perfect for concealing troops. Hannibal positioned his army carefully. He placed his main force on the far side of the river, visible to the Romans, arranged in battle order but not advancing. Then he selected 2,000 men, 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, all picked warriors, and placed them under the command of his brother Mago. These men crept into the gullies and ravines in the night, carrying food and water for a long wait, and concealed themselves completely. At dawn, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the Trebia to harass the Roman camp. They rode close, threw javelins, shouted insults, then retreated when the Romans responded. It was a calculated provocation designed to enrage and entice. Consul Longus took the bait. Despite warnings from his wounded colleague Scipio, despite the early hour and the fact that his men had not eaten breakfast, Longus ordered his army to pursue the Numidians. The legions formed up and marched out of camp, chasing the fleeing cavalry. The Romans had to cross the Trebia River. It was December. The water was chest deep and bitterly cold. 40,000 men waded through that frigid water, their armor weighing them down, their bodies going numb from the cold. By the time they emerged on the far side, they were already exhausted, hypothermic, hungry. They had not eaten before the pursuit began, and now it was mid-morning, and they had been marching and waiting for hours.
The Numidian cavalry led them on, staying just out of reach, until the Roman army was fully committed, fully across the river, fully deployed on the plain where Hannibal waited. Then the Numidians wheeled away, and the main Carthaginian army advanced. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of tactical manipulation. The Roman infantry, despite their condition, were still formidable. They crashed into Hannibal's center and actually began to push it back. The Roman discipline and training showed. They were cold, tired, hungry, but they were legionaries, and they knew how to fight. But while the infantry were engaged in the center, Hannibal's cavalry, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, swept around the Roman flanks. They overwhelmed the Roman cavalry on both wings, driving them from the field. Then they turned inward, attacking the flanks of the Roman infantry. And at the crucial moment, when the Romans were fully engaged on three sides, Mago's hidden force erupted from the ravines behind them. 2,000 fresh warriors hitting the Roman rear without warning. The psychological impact was devastating. The Romans suddenly found themselves surrounded, attacked from all sides, with no clear line of retreat. Panic spread through the Roman ranks. Units began to break, soldiers fleeing toward the river or simply throwing down their weapons and surrendering. The center of the Roman line, about 10,000 legionaries, managed to maintain cohesion and fought their way through the Carthaginian lines, escaping to the nearby Roman colony of Placentia. But the rest of the army was destroyed, killed, captured, or scattered. The Trebia River, already cold, ran red with Roman blood. Thousands of Rome's soldiers died there, drowned while trying to flee back across the river or cut down by Carthaginian cavalry pursuing them. The winter storm that came later that day, dumping snow on the battlefield, covered the dead in a white shroud. Rome had lost another army, 2 consular defeats in the space of weeks. The news, when it reached the city, caused something close to panic. Who was this Hannibal? How was he winning these victories? The Romans had fought Carthaginians before, in the First Punic War, and while those wars had been difficult, the Carthaginians had never seemed particularly brilliant on land. But this general, this son of Hannibal Barca, was different. He fought unlike any enemy Rome had ever faced. He used terrain, he used psychology, he baited traps, and the Romans walked into them. He combined different types of troops, heavy infantry, light infantry, various cavalry, in ways that maximized their strengths and covered their weaknesses. He was unpredictable, creative, willing to take risks that paid off spectacularly. And perhaps most unsettling for the Romans, he was winning over their allies. The Italian Confederation that gave Rome its strength was based on loyalty, on the benefits of being part of the Roman system. But Hannibal was showing the Italian peoples that Rome could be defeated, that there was an alternative. Some of the Gallic tribes in the north had already switched sides. Would others follow?
Winter settled over Italy, bringing a pause to major military operations. Hannibal quartered his army in the Po Valley, resting his men, training his new Gallic recruits, planning his next moves. The elephants, those magnificent beasts that had survived the ALPS, continued to suffer in the cold. More of them died during that winter, succumbing to illnesses and the effects of prolonged exposure. By spring, Hannibal would have only one elephant left, a particularly large and fierce beast that he reportedly rode into battle. The psychological warfare continued even during the winter months. Hannibal treated Roman prisoners in an interesting way. The Romans themselves he kept as hostages, but the Italian allies who had been fighting for Rome, he released them, without ransom, without conditions. He told them to go home and tell their people that Hannibal had not come to fight against them, but to liberate them from Roman domination. It was brilliant propaganda. Even if the released soldiers did not believe him, the gesture planted seeds of doubt. Why was Hannibal being kind to Rome's allies while being harsh to Romans themselves? Was there perhaps some truth to his claim that Rome was the real oppressor? In Rome itself, the winter was spent in frantic preparation. New legions were raised, new consuls were elected. Sacrifices were made to the gods, asking for divine protection. The Senate debated strategy endlessly. Should they defend conservatively, protecting Roman territory? Should they try to cut off Hannibal's supply lines? Should they send armies to attack Carthage directly, forcing Hannibal to return home? But while the Romans debated, Hannibal had already made his decision. He would not wait for Rome to bring the fight to him. He would not sit in the Po Valley and defend his position. Instead, he would march south, deeper into Italy, striking at Rome's heartland, forcing the Romans to fight on ground of his choosing. In the spring of 217 BCE, as the snows melted and the passes cleared, Hannibal broke camp and led his army south. He took a route that surprised the Romans. Instead of using the main roads, he led his army through the marshes of the Arno River, a treacherous waterlogged region that the Romans had assumed was impassable to a large army. The march through the marshes was a nightmare. The army waded through water and mud for days, unable to rest on dry ground, unable to sleep properly. Men and animals succumbed to exhaustion and disease. Hannibal himself suffered, developing an eye infection that eventually cost him the sight in one eye. But he pushed through, refusing to show weakness, setting an example of endurance for his soldiers. And when they emerged from the marshes, they were south of the main Roman defensive positions, once again where Rome had not expected them to be. Hannibal was in central Italy now, in the prosperous region of Etruria, Roman territory, the heartland of Rome's power, and he was looking for another Roman army to destroy, another opportunity to demonstrate that Rome was not invincible. He would not have to wait long. The Romans, shocked by Hannibal's audacious march through the marshes, were gathering another army. A new consul, Gaius Flaminius, was taking command, and Flaminius was angry, eager to avenge the defeats at Ticinus and Trebia, determined to drive this Carthaginian invader from Italian soil. Hannibal studied the reports of Flaminius's movements, assessed the consul's character, analyzed the terrain ahead, and he began to plan his next trap. There was a lake in Etruria, a large body of water called TRASIMENE, and along its northern shore a narrow road passed between the lake and steep hills. It was a confined space, a perfect killing ground for an army that knew what it was doing. Hannibal smiled. He had crossed the Alps, won 2 major battles, marched through impassable marshes, and now he would teach Rome another lesson in what was possible. The stage was set for the greatest ambush in ancient history.
There is something almost poetic about what happened at Lake Trasimene. Not in the sense of beautiful. There was nothing beautiful about what occurred there on that June morning in 217 BCE, but poetic in the sense of a perfect trap, perfectly executed against an enemy who walked willingly into destruction. Hannibal understood Gaius Flaminius. He had studied the man from a distance, gathering intelligence, learning his character and temperament. Flaminius was a populist, a man who had risen to power on the support of the common people rather than the traditional aristocracy. He was proud, ambitious, and, crucially, hot-tempered. He had something to prove, both to his political enemies in Rome and to himself, and Hannibal knew how to use that. As Hannibal's army moved through Etruria, they systematically ravaged the countryside. They burned farmhouses, destroyed crops, drove off livestock. It was strategic devastation, designed not just to feed the Carthaginian army, but to provoke Flaminius. Every column of smoke rising on the horizon was a taunt, a challenge, an insult to Roman honor. Flaminius, watching this destruction of Roman territory, grew increasingly furious. His advisors counseled caution,
Wait for the other consul's army to arrive, they said. Combine forces before engaging Hannibal. But Flaminius did not want to wait. He did not want to share the glory of defeating Hannibal with another consul, and he could not bear to watch Roman lands burn while he sat idle. So he pursued. With an army of approximately 25,000 men, 2 Roman legions, and supporting allied troops, Flaminius marched after Hannibal, following the trail of destruction the Carthaginians left in their wake. Hannibal led him on, always staying just ahead, visible but out of reach, a tantalizing target that seemed always on the verge of being caught. And all the while, Hannibal was steering Flaminius toward Lake TRASIMENE, toward the trap he had prepared. The lake was beautiful in its way, a large body of clear water surrounded by hills, reflecting the sky. The road along its northern shore was narrow, squeezed between the water's edge and steep wooded hills. It was perhaps 3 miles long, this killing ground, with only 2 ways out, the narrow entrance where the road approached the lake and the narrow exit where it departed. Hannibal positioned his army with meticulous care. He placed his African and Iberian infantry at the far end of the pass, visible to anyone entering. They would be the bait, the apparent Carthaginian army that Flaminius would see and think he had finally caught. But in the hills above the road, hidden in the forests and gullies, Hannibal concealed the rest of his forces. Light infantry among the trees on the slopes, cavalry at the entrance to the pass, ready to seal it once the Romans had entered, Gallic warriors on the heights, eager and deadly. The positioning took time, required absolute discipline. Thousands of men had to move into position in darkness, had to remain silent and hidden through the night. But Hannibal's army was experienced now, hardened by months of campaigning, and they trusted their commander completely. If Hannibal said to lie quietly in the cold darkness and wait, they would lie quietly and wait.
On the morning of June 21st, 217 BCE, Consul Flaminius and his army approached Lake TRASIMENE. They had been marching since before dawn, eager to catch up with the Carthaginian force that had been eluding them for days. And there, at the far end of the lakeside road, they could see Hannibal's camp, his soldiers moving about, apparently unaware of the Roman approach. Flaminius did not hesitate. He ordered his army forward, into the narrow pass between the lake and the hills. The Roman column stretched out, 25,000 men filing along that narrow road, their attention focused ahead on the visible Carthaginian force at the far end. And then, as if the gods themselves had conspired with Hannibal, a fog rolled in. Lake TRASIMENE on early summer mornings often produces a heavy mist. Warm air from the land meets cool air over the water, and fog forms, thick and disorienting. That morning, the fog was particularly dense, reducing visibility to a few yards. The Romans, already stretched out in a long, vulnerable column, could barely see the men in front of or behind them. Hannibal, watching from the hills, must have offered a prayer of thanks to whatever gods were listening. This fog was a gift, one more element that would turn his trap into a perfect massacre. When the Roman column was fully committed, when the last of Flaminius's soldiers had entered the pass, when there was no easy way to retreat or redeploy, Hannibal gave the signal. The attack came from all sides at once. Carthaginian infantry poured down from the hills, appearing out of the fog like ghosts, crashing into the Roman column. The Gauls screamed their war cries, the sound echoing off the hillsides, adding to the confusion. Cavalry sealed off the entrance to the pass, preventing any escape in that direction. The Romans had no time to form proper battle lines. They were caught in marching column, the worst possible formation for receiving an attack. Units were scattered, separated by the fog, unable to see what was happening more than a few yards away. Officers tried to give orders, but their voices were lost in the chaos of battle, the screams of dying men, the clash of weapons.
Flaminius himself, to his credit, did not try to flee. When he realized what was happening, he attempted to rally his troops to create some kind of organized defense. But it was hopeless. The Romans were being killed where they stood, pushed back into the lake where they drowned under the weight of their armor, or driven against the hillsides where Carthaginian infantry cut them down. The battle, if it can even be called a battle, lasted perhaps 3 hours. 3 hours of slaughter in the fog. The Romans fought bravely, desperately, but they were fighting blind, disorganized, overwhelmed. Some units managed to break through and escape. A force of about 6,000 legionaries fought their way out of the trap and fled to a nearby hilltop where they held out until they were surrounded and forced to surrender the next day. But most of Flaminius's army died there at Lake TRASIMENE. 15,000 Roman and allied soldiers were killed. The survivors, those who were not among the 6,000 who escaped temporarily, were captured. And Consul Gaius Flaminius himself was killed. A Gallic warrior seeking revenge for past Roman atrocities against his people recognized the consul's armor and insignia. The Gaul rode through the chaos of battle, found Flaminius attempting to rally his troops, and struck him down with a spear thrust. The consul died in the fog, his body trampled by the men he had led into disaster.
When the fog finally lifted, the scene it revealed was nightmarish. The shore of Lake TRASIMENE was carpeted with Roman dead. The water at the edge of the lake was red with blood. Weapons and armor and bodies lay everywhere, thousands upon thousands of them. The hillsides were littered with Roman corpses. The road that had been a passage was now a graveyard. Hannibal walked the battlefield afterward, surveying the carnage. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, that he ordered a search for Flaminius's body, wanting to give the consul an honorable burial as a gesture of respect to a worthy enemy. But the body was never found, lost among the thousands of dead, indistinguishable in the aftermath of the massacre. The Carthaginian losses were minimal, perhaps 1,500 men killed or wounded, most of them Gauls who had fought with more enthusiasm than discipline. It was barely a fight from Hannibal's perspective. It had been an execution, a demonstration of what perfect planning and perfect positioning could achieve. News of the disaster reached Rome in stages, each report more terrible than the last. First came rumors that Flaminius's army had been engaged. Then came confirmation of a defeat. Then the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. Not just a defeat, but a destruction. An entire consular army gone. A consul dead. 15,000 Roman and allied soldiers killed or captured. Rome had not experienced such a defeat in living memory. The city went into mourning. Families gathered in the forum, desperate for news of loved ones. Women wept in the streets. The Senate met in emergency session, trying to comprehend what had happened, trying to figure out how to respond. And the news kept getting worse. A few days after TRASIMENE, another disaster struck. A force of 4,000 cavalry, sent as reinforcements for Flaminius before anyone knew he was dead, was intercepted by Carthaginian forces. The cavalry commander, Gaius Centenius, had no idea what had happened at the lake. He rode straight into another Carthaginian trap. His entire force was destroyed, killed or captured, adding another 4,000 casualties to Rome's losses. In the span of a few days, Rome had lost 2 consular armies and gained nothing in return. Hannibal was still in Italy, still undefeated, still marching wherever he pleased. The Italian allies were watching, calculating, wondering if Rome was truly as invincible as they had been told. The Senate took extraordinary measures. They appointed a dictator, a single commander given absolute authority for 6 months to deal with the crisis. His name was Quintus Fabius Maximus, and he would approach the problem of Hannibal in a way that none of his predecessors had. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in the aftermath of Lake TRASIMENE, Rome was in shock. They had underestimated Hannibal at Ticinus. They'd been overconfident at Trebia. They'd been outmaneuvered and massacred at TRASIMENE. 3 battles, 3 devastating defeats, and Hannibal had been in Italy for less than a year. In Carthage, when news of these victories arrived, there must have been celebration. The impossible had happened. Hamilcar's son had done what no one thought could be done. He had brought Rome to its knees. Or so it seemed. Surely now Rome would seek peace, would negotiate, would offer Carthage favorable terms to end this war. But Carthage did not know Rome as well as Hannibal did. Rome did not negotiate from weakness. Rome did not surrender, not ever. Defeat only made them more determined, more dangerous, more willing to pay any price to achieve victory. Hannibal understood this. He knew that TRASIMENE, devastating as it was, had not ended the war. It had not even truly crippled Rome's ability to fight. Rome's strength lay in its confederation, in its ability to raise new legions from its vast pool of manpower. As long as that confederation held, as long as Rome's Italian allies remained loyal, Rome could replace its losses and continue the war. Hannibal needed something more. He needed a victory so complete, so overwhelming, that it would shatter Rome's confidence and break the Italian Confederation. He needed to prove, beyond any doubt, that Rome could not protect its allies, that the Roman system was finished. He would get his chance. 1 year later, at a place called CANNAE, Hannibal would fight the battle that would make him immortal, the battle that would be studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. But that was still in the future. For now, in the summer of 217 BCE, Hannibal marched south through Italy, gathering supplies, recruiting allies, resting his army, and preparing for whatever came next. Rome watched him come and prepared its own response. They would not make the same mistakes again. They would not rush into another ambush. They would be patient, careful, methodical. They would see if patience and care would be enough to stop the lightning that was Hannibal Barca. After Lake Trasimene, Rome changed its strategy. The dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, refused to give Hannibal the kind of open battle he wanted. Instead, Fabius shadowed the Carthaginian army, always keeping to the high ground, never engaging directly, cutting off foraging parties, harassing stragglers, denying Hannibal supplies and recruits. It was frustrating, unglamorous work. The Romans called Fabius the delayer, and not always as a compliment. Many thought him cowardly, thought he was afraid to fight, but Fabius understood something important. He could not beat Hannibal in open battle, so he would not try. He would simply wait and watch and hope that time and attrition would solve the problem that Roman swords could not. For months, this strategy worked. Hannibal marched through southern Italy, but his army grew no larger. The Italian allies, seeing that Rome still had forces in the field, remained cautiously loyal. Carthage sent little support. They were fighting their own wars in Iberia and Sicily. Hannibal was isolated, deep in enemy territory, unable to force a decisive engagement. But then Fabius's term as dictator ended. In the spring of 216 BCE, new consuls were elected. One of them was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a cautious, experienced commander who understood Fabius's strategy. The other was Gaius Terentius Varro, a man of common birth who had risen through populist politics, who believed that Fabius had been too timid, that Rome needed to destroy Hannibal decisively and immediately. The Senate, still reeling from Trasimene, gave these consuls the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 8 legions, normally Rome fielded 4 at most, plus supporting allied troops. Perhaps 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. It was a massive force, an army designed to overwhelm Hannibal through sheer numbers. The strategy was debated. Paulus wanted to continue Fabius's approach, avoiding battle until circumstances were favorable. Varro wanted to attack, to bring Hannibal to battle and crush him. Roman custom dictated that the 2 consuls alternated command daily when campaigning together, so the army's strategy shifted back and forth between caution and aggression as the days passed. Hannibal watched this enormous Roman army march toward him, and he understood the opportunity it represented. If he could destroy this force, if he could defeat the largest army Rome had ever assembled, the psychological impact would be enormous. The Italian Confederation might finally crack. Rome itself might seek peace. But how do you defeat an army that outnumbers you nearly 2-to-1? How do you overcome such a disparity in numbers? Hannibal had an idea. A risky, audacious idea that would require perfect timing, perfect discipline, and perfect execution. But if it worked, it would be the most brilliant tactical victory in the history of warfare. The two armies converged near a town called CANNAE in the heel of Italy, in the region of Apulia. It was August, hot and dry, the sun beating down mercilessly on soldiers and armor. Near CANNAE was a Roman supply depot that Hannibal had captured, and the consuls were determined to reclaim it. On August 2nd, 216 BCE, the armies faced each other across a flat plain. It was Varro's day to command, and he ordered the Roman army into battle formation.
The Romans deployed in their traditional style, but deeper than usual. The infantry was packed into a dense mass in the center, perhaps 50 ranks deep. Normally they would be 10 or 12 ranks deep, but with so many men, the commanders wanted to use their numerical advantage to simply overwhelm the Carthaginian center through sheer weight and pressure. The Roman cavalry was positioned on the wings, though they were heavily outnumbered by Hannibal's horsemen. Hannibal's deployment was unusual, even strange to Roman eyes. He placed his infantry in the center as well, but instead of forming them in a straight line, he arranged them in a convex arc, bulging forward toward the Romans. The Gauls and Iberians formed this forward bulge, while his African veterans were positioned on the flanks, pulled back slightly from the center. On Hannibal's left wing, he placed his Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry. On his right wing, his Numidian light cavalry. Both cavalry forces outnumbered their Roman counterparts significantly. To an experienced Roman commander, Hannibal's formation might have looked like a mistake. The convex arc of his center meant his line was longer and thinner than it needed to be. It looked weak, vulnerable. A strong Roman push in the center would break through easily. But that was exactly what Hannibal wanted the Romans to think. The battle began, as many ancient battles did, with skirmishing. Light troops from both sides, slingers, javelin throwers, exchanged missiles, testing each other, trying to disrupt the enemy formations. Then the real battle commenced. On Hannibal's left, the Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry charged into the Roman cavalry. It was a brutal, desperate melee. The Roman horsemen fought hard, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Slowly, inexorably, they were pushed back, then broken. The survivors fled the field, and Hannibal's heavy cavalry pursued them for a distance before wheeling back toward the main battle. On the right, the Numidian cavalry engaged the Italian allied cavalry. This was a different kind of fight, more mobile, more fluid, with the Numidians using their superior horsemanship to harass and confuse the enemy. The allied cavalry could not break through, could not effectively support the infantry, and were gradually drawn away from the main battle. But the center was where the decisive action would occur. The Roman infantry advanced in their massive formation, a wall of shields and spears and grim determination. 80,000 men moving forward in lockstep, the ground trembling beneath their feet. They crashed into Hannibal's center, into the arc of Gallic and Iberian troops who stood forward to meet them. The fighting was savage. The Gauls and Iberians held their ground for a while, trading blows with the Romans, but they were outnumbered and under tremendous pressure. Slowly, they began to give way. The arc that had bulged forward toward the Romans now began to flatten. The Carthaginian center was being pushed back. From the Roman perspective, their strategy was working perfectly. Their mass and weight were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, overwhelming the enemy center, crushing it inward. The Roman officers shouted encouragement. Victory seemed within reach. Just keep pushing,
keep pressing forward, and the Carthaginian line would break. The Carthaginian center continued to bend backward. The arc flattened, then began to curve the other way, forming a concave shape, with the Romans pressing into the center of it. The Gauls and Iberians were fighting desperately now, giving ground step by step, their line threatening to break at any moment.
But it did not break. Hannibal had positioned himself with these troops, fighting alongside them, visible to every man, his presence holding the line together through sheer force of will. When men looked like they might flee, they saw Hannibal there, sword in hand, and they stood fast. When officers worried the line would collapse, they saw their commander holding his position, and they held theirs. The Roman army pressed deeper into the Carthaginian center, packing themselves into an ever tighter formation as the enemy line bent backward around them. The Romans were so focused on the breakthrough they sensed coming, so intent on the enemy in front of them, that they did not notice what was happening on their flanks. Hannibal's African veterans, those troops that had been positioned slightly back from the center, now began to advance. They pivoted inward, wheeling like gates swinging shut, and attacked the flanks of the Roman formation. The Romans had packed themselves so densely in their drive forward that they had no room to maneuver. The men on the edges of the formation found themselves under attack from the side, and they could not turn to face this new threat. There was no space, no room to shift their shields or reposition their ranks. The Africans, disciplined and deadly, cut into the Roman flanks with methodical efficiency. They were equipped with captured Roman weapons and armor from previous battles, and they knew how to use them. They pushed inward, carving into the packed mass of Roman soldiers. And then Hannibal's cavalry returned. The Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen on the left, had circled around the battlefield. Now they charged into the rear of the Roman infantry. At almost the same moment, the Numidians broke free from their engagement with the allied cavalry and attacked the Roman rear from the other side. The trap was complete. The Roman army, 80,000 strong, was now surrounded. They were packed so tightly together that men could barely lift their weapons. The outer ranks were being cut down by Carthaginian infantry and cavalry attacking from all sides. The inner ranks could not reach the enemy, could not fight, could only stand and wait as the circle of death constricted around them. This was the double envelopment, the perfect encirclement, the tactical maneuver that would echo through military history for millennia. Hannibal had not just defeated the Roman army, he had trapped it, surrounded it, and was methodically annihilating it. The slaughter lasted for hours. The afternoon sun beat down on the packed mass of soldiers, adding heat exhaustion and thirst to the list of horrors the Romans were enduring. Men died from wounds, from being crushed by the press of bodies, from heat stroke. Some tried to surrender, but there was little quarter given. Hannibal's men were enraged by the heat, the exhaustion, and memories of their own losses in previous campaigns. Consul Paulus, who had argued against giving battle on this day, died fighting in the center of the formation, surrounded by his troops, refusing to flee. He died knowing that his caution had been overruled, that his worst fears had come to pass. Consul Varro, on the other hand, survived. He was with the cavalry on the right when it broke, and he fled with the survivors, eventually making his way back to Rome to report the disaster. By the time the sun set on that August day, the plain of CANNAE was covered with Roman dead. The ancient sources disagree on the exact numbers, they always do, but even the most conservative estimates are staggering. Perhaps 50,000 Roman and Allied soldiers were killed at CANNAE. Some sources suggest the number was closer to 70,000. To put that in perspective, that's more soldiers killed in a single day than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War, more dead than Britain lost on the first day of the Somme in World War I. It was, relative to the populations of the time, an almost incomprehensible level of carnage. In addition to the dead, thousands more were captured. Only about 10,000 Romans managed to escape the battlefield, and many of these were wounded or traumatized. 3 entire legions had been effectively wiped out. Rome had lost approximately 1/5 of its adult male citizen population in a single afternoon. The Carthaginian losses, by contrast, were relatively light. Perhaps 6,000 men killed or wounded, most of them the Gauls who had borne the brunt of the initial Roman assault.
When news of CANNAE reached Rome, the city went into crisis. There was genuine fear that Hannibal would march on Rome itself, that the city would be besieged and taken, that the Roman Republic would cease to exist. Families gathered what they could carry and prepared to flee. The Senate met in emergency session. Defensive preparations began, though everyone knew that Rome's walls had not been tested in battle for generations and might not hold against a determined assault. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. This decision has been debated by historians ever since. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, allegedly urged him to strike immediately, saying, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." But Hannibal refused. Perhaps he knew that besieging Rome itself would be nearly impossible without proper siege equipment, which he lacked. Perhaps he calculated that his army, though victorious, was exhausted and in no condition for a major siege. Perhaps he believed that CANNAE alone would be enough to break the Italian Confederation, that Rome's allies would now abandon them and the war would end without needing to assault the city itself. Whatever his reasoning, Hannibal did not march on Rome. Instead, he continued his campaign in southern Italy, still hoping to break Rome's alliances, still waiting for Rome to accept that they were beaten. But Rome did not accept it. Despite the catastrophic defeat, despite the unprecedented casualties, despite the genuine fear that gripped the city, Rome did not surrender. The Senate passed a decree forbidding public mourning. There would be time for tears later, but now was the time for action. New legions were raised from boys as young as 17, from slaves who were promised freedom in exchange for service, from any man who could hold a weapon. The families of those who died at CANNAE were devastated, but they did not call for peace. They called for revenge. Rome had lost 50,000 men in a day, and the response was not to sue for peace, but to raise more armies. CANNAE is still studied today in military academies around the world. It is considered the perfect tactical battle, the ideal example of how to use maneuver and positioning to defeat a superior force. The double envelopment that Hannibal executed that day has been attempted countless times by generals throughout history, though rarely with the same success. The German military studied CANNAE intensively before World War I, hoping to recreate Hannibal's achievement. Norman Schwarzkopf referenced CANNAE when planning the Gulf War's ground campaign. Modern military theorists still analyze the battle, still try to understand exactly how Hannibal coordinated his forces so perfectly, how he managed to maintain control over troops from so many different cultures and backgrounds, how he turned what should have been a devastating defeat into the most complete tactical victory in military history. But for all its brilliance, CANNAE did not end the war. It did not break Rome. It proved that Hannibal was a genius on the battlefield, perhaps the greatest tactical commander who ever lived. But it also proved something else, that Rome's strength lay not in any single army, but in its ability to endure, to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting, to refuse defeat no matter the cost. The war would continue for another 14 years after CANNAE. 14 years of campaigns in Italy, of slow Roman recovery, of gradual Carthaginian decline. CANNAE was the high point of Hannibal's Italian campaign, the moment when he came closest to actually defeating Rome. But the moment passed. Rome survived, and slowly, inexorably, the tide would begin to turn. Yet on that August evening in 216 BCE, as Hannibal surveyed the field of his greatest triumph, as his soldiers rested among the Roman dead, as the magnitude of what he had accomplished began to sink in, he must have felt that final victory was within his grasp.
He had crossed the Alps. He had won every battle. He had destroyed the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Surely now, after CANNAE, Rome would see reason. Surely now they would negotiate, would offer peace, would accept that they could not defeat him. He did not yet understand that Rome would never accept defeat, that they would endure any loss, pay any price, sacrifice any number of lives, rather than bow before an enemy. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over.
After CANNAE, Hannibal waited for Rome to collapse. He waited for the Italian Confederation to dissolve, for Rome's allies to abandon them, for delegations from the Senate to arrive seeking peace terms. He had done everything a general could do. He had won every battle, defeated every army Rome had sent against him. Surely now the war would end. Some of the Italian allies did defect, most notably the city of Capua, the second largest city in Italy, wealthy and sophisticated, opened its gates to Hannibal. It was a significant victory, a symbolic blow to Rome's prestige. Other cities followed. Towns in southern Italy, particularly in regions that had resented Roman dominance, welcomed the Carthaginians as liberators. But the defections were not as widespread as Hannibal had hoped. Most of Rome's allies, even after CANNAE, remained loyal. Some stayed out of genuine commitment to the Roman cause. Others stayed because they feared Roman revenge more than they feared Carthaginian victory. And some stayed because they calculated, perhaps correctly, that Rome would ultimately prevail despite its defeats. The Latin colonies, the cities that Rome had planted throughout Italy, populated with Roman citizens, remained absolutely loyal. These colonies formed a defensive network throughout the peninsula, strong points that Hannibal could not ignore but lacked the equipment and manpower to besiege effectively. They were like islands of Roman power in a sea of uncertain allegiances. And Rome itself, that should have been paralyzed by fear after CANNAE, instead hardened its resolve. The Senate refused to ransom the Roman prisoners Hannibal had captured, thousands of men who might have been returned for a reasonable price. It was a brutal decision, condemning these men to slavery or death, but it sent a clear message. Rome would not negotiate with Hannibal, would not acknowledge his victories, would not accept anything less than total victory. New armies were raised, boys became soldiers, slaves were freed and armed. Rome reached deep into its reserves of manpower, drawing on resources that Hannibal had not fully appreciated. The Italian Confederation gave Rome access to an enormous pool of potential soldiers, and Rome was willing to pay any price in blood to keep fighting. The strategy that Quintus Fabius Maximus had pioneered before CANNAE was now adopted as official Roman policy. They called it the Fabian strategy, after its originator, though Romans at the time simply called it common sense. Do not give Hannibal the kind of set-piece battle where his genius could shine. Instead, shadow him, harass him, cut off his supplies, attack his foraging parties, make every day a struggle, and wait for time and attrition to do what Roman swords could not. Multiple Roman armies were kept in the field, never large enough to tempt Hannibal into attacking them, but always present, always watching. When Hannibal moved, they moved. When he tried to gather supplies, they interfered. When cities wavered in their loyalty to Rome, Roman armies would appear to remind them of the consequences of defection. It was frustrating, unglamorous warfare. There were no great battles, no opportunities for glory, but it was effective. Hannibal found himself trapped in a strategic stalemate. He could march anywhere in southern Italy, but he could not force Rome to give him the decisive confrontation he needed. He could win every tactical engagement, but the strategic situation remained unchanged. His army, though victorious, was slowly declining. Every skirmish cost lives that could not be easily replaced. Every month spent in the field depleted supplies that could not be replenished. Every winter that passed saw more men succumb to disease, injury, or simple exhaustion.
Hannibal sent messages to Carthage pleading for reinforcements, for supplies, for siege equipment that would allow him to take the Latin colonies and Rome's other strongholds. But Carthage's response was frustratingly inadequate. Part of the problem was that Carthage itself was divided. The Barcid faction supported Hannibal enthusiastically, but there were other factions in the Carthaginian Senate that had never wanted this war, that resented the Barcid family's dominance, that saw Hannibal's campaign as a dangerous gamble that was draining Carthaginian resources for uncertain gains. And Carthage was fighting on other fronts. In Iberia, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal was waging a desperate campaign against Roman forces that had invaded Carthaginian territory there. In Sicily, Carthage was trying to take advantage of local rebellions against Rome. Resources were stretched thin, and the support Hannibal needed was being directed elsewhere or not provided at all.
The reinforcements that did arrive were too little, too late. A few thousand men here, some supplies there, but nothing approaching what Hannibal needed to break the stalemate. He was essentially on his own in Italy, expected to conquer Rome with the forces he had, with minimal support from home. It must have been incredibly frustrating. Hannibal had done the impossible, crossed the Alps, defeated every Roman army, won the greatest tactical victory in history, and yet he was trapped, unable to translate battlefield success into strategic victory, slowly watching his position deteriorate. The city of Capua, which had welcomed Hannibal so enthusiastically after CANNAE, became emblematic of the problems he faced. Capua was rich, comfortable, luxurious. The ancient sources, mostly Roman admittedly and therefore biased, claim that Hannibal's army grew soft during their time in Capua, that the soldiers who had endured the Alps and CANNAE became corrupted by luxury, that they lost their edge. Whether this is true or exaggerated, Capua certainly became a liability. Rome besieged the city, and Hannibal was forced to try to relieve it. He marched his army to the gates of Rome itself, hoping to draw the Roman forces away from Capua by threatening the capital. It was a bold move, reminiscent of his earlier audacity. But Rome did not take the bait. The Roman forces besieging Capua remained in place, and the defenders of Rome itself manned their walls and refused to engage. Hannibal marched around Rome's walls, apparently hurling a javelin over them in a gesture of defiance, but he could not force a battle. Without siege equipment, without the numbers to properly invest the city, he could do nothing but look at Rome's walls and then march away. Capua eventually fell to the Romans. The surrender terms were harsh. The city's leaders were executed, its citizens punished, its wealth confiscated. It was a demonstration of what happened to those who betrayed Rome, a warning to any other Italian city that might be considering defection. The years passed, and the war ground on. Hannibal remained in southern Italy, moving from place to place, winning tactical victories when Roman forces were foolish enough to engage him directly, but unable to change the strategic picture. He was like a chess grandmaster who could win every exchange, but was slowly running out of pieces while his opponent had unlimited replacements. His army changed character over the years. The veterans who had crossed the Alps with him dwindled in number, lost to combat and disease and simple exhaustion. They were replaced by Italian recruits, by Gallic warriors, by mercenaries from various peoples. These new soldiers were less experienced, less reliable, less bound to Hannibal by the shared ordeals that had forged his original army. Hannibal himself must have aged during these years. He had been 29 at CANNAE, a young man in his prime. Now he was in his 30s, still brilliant, still dangerous, but carrying the weight of years of inconclusive campaigning, of frustrated hopes, of the gradual realization that his great gamble might not succeed. The psychological toll must have been immense. He had left everything he knew to come to Italy. His family, his home, the lands he had conquered in Iberia, all were far away, separated by Roman-controlled seas and hostile territory. He received news from Carthage irregularly, never knowing if his letters were getting through, never sure what the political situation at home might be. And always there was the knowledge that time was not on his side. Every year he remained in Italy without achieving final victory was a year that Rome's position strengthened.
New generals were rising in Rome, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors, adapting to Hannibal's tactics. The most promising of these was a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same Scipio whose father Hannibal had wounded at Ticinus, who had allegedly saved his father's life in that battle. Young Scipio was given command of Roman forces in Iberia, and he began to systematically dismantle Carthaginian power there. He was learning from Hannibal, studying his tactics, understanding his methods, and he was winning, reclaiming for Rome the territory that Hamilcar and Hasdrubal and Hannibal himself had spent years securing. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, fighting in Iberia, eventually made a desperate gamble. He gathered an army and marched to Italy, following the route Hannibal had taken years before, hoping to cross the Alps and join his brother. With 2 Carthaginian armies in Italy, perhaps the stalemate could be broken. Perhaps Rome could finally be defeated. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That story belongs to the next chapter of Hannibal's life, to the moment when hope and despair would collide on the banks of an Italian river. For now, in the middle years of the war, Hannibal simply endured. He marched through southern Italy, a ghost of the force that had terrorized Rome after CANNAE. His army was still dangerous. Roman commanders who underestimated him still paid the price. But the grand strategic vision, the dream of breaking Rome's power forever, seemed increasingly distant.
At night, sitting in his tent, planning the next day's march, did Hannibal think about his father? Did he remember the oath he had sworn as a 9-year-old boy, the promise of eternal enmity to Rome? He had kept that oath. He had made Rome suffer as no enemy had ever made them suffer. But he had not broken them, had not brought them to their knees, had not achieved the final victory that would justify all the years of struggle and sacrifice. The weather changed with the seasons. Summer heat gave way to autumn rains, gave way to winter cold. Hannibal aged. His soldiers aged. The war, which had seemed so decisive after CANNAE, became a war of attrition, of diminishing returns, of hopes slowly fading like the light at the end of a long day. But Hannibal did not surrender. He did not give up. He continued to fight, to maneuver, to hope that somehow, some way the situation would change in his favor. He was Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, the man who had crossed the Alps. He had come too far to quit now. The Italian countryside, which had seemed so promising after his early victories, became a prison without walls. He could go anywhere, but nowhere was safe. He could defeat any Roman army foolish enough to fight him, but there were always more Roman armies. He had proven himself the greatest tactical general of his age, perhaps of any age, but tactics alone could not win this war. Rome had learned the lesson that Fabius had tried to teach them before CANNAE. You did not need to defeat Hannibal in battle. You just needed to outlast him, to wait him out, to let time and distance and lack of support do what swords and spears could not. And so the years passed, and Hannibal remained in Italy, brilliant and dangerous, and slowly, inexorably, running out of time.
In the year 207 BCE, Hannibal received news that must have lifted his spirits for the first time in years. His brother Hasdrubal had successfully gathered an army in Iberia and was marching toward the Alps. He had perhaps 30,000 men with him, including war elephants, siege equipment, and supplies. If Hasdrubal could cross the mountains, as Hannibal had done 11 years earlier, if he could bring this fresh army to Italy, they could combine their forces and perhaps finally break the stalemate. Hannibal began moving north through Italy, trying to position himself to meet his brother. Messengers were sent, trying to coordinate their movements, trying to arrange a rendezvous point where the two armies could join. For the first time in years, Hannibal must have felt hope stirring in his chest. He would not be alone anymore. Carthage had finally sent meaningful reinforcements. Together, the Barca brothers could accomplish what Hannibal alone could not.
But the Romans were watching. They had learned over the years to respect Hannibal's intelligence network, to move carefully, to guard against his spies and informants. And they had learned something else. While they could not defeat Hannibal in open battle, they could be more aggressive against other Carthaginian commanders. Hasdrubal crossed the Alps successfully, though the crossing cost him dearly, much as it had cost Hannibal. He emerged into northern Italy with a depleted but still formidable force. And then he made a mistake. He sent messengers to Hannibal, riders carrying letters with detailed information about his position, his strength, his proposed route south. These messengers were supposed to slip through the Roman lines and find Hannibal in southern Italy. But the messengers were captured. The Romans intercepted them, read the letters, and suddenly knew everything. Where Hasdrubal was, how many men he had, where he was planning to go, where he hoped to meet Hannibal. The Roman response was swift and coordinated. Consul Gaius Claudius Nero, who had been shadowing Hannibal in the south, made a bold decision. He took a portion of his army, perhaps 7,000 men, and marched north at forced pace, leaving enough troops behind to maintain the appearance of a full army confronting Hannibal. It was a risky gambit. If Hannibal realized what was happening, he could destroy the reduced Roman force and then march north unopposed. But Hannibal did not realize. Nero's march was conducted with such speed and secrecy that Hannibal remained unaware. Meanwhile, in northern Italy, the other consul, Marcus Livius Salinator, was confronting Hasdrubal with his own army. When Nero's reinforcements arrived, Livius now commanded a force nearly equal to Hasdrubal's. The two armies met on the banks of the Metaurus River in June of 207 BCE. Hasdrubal was an experienced commander, a capable general who had fought successfully in Iberia for years. But he was not Hannibal. He did not have his brother's genius for reading terrain, for anticipating enemy moves, for adapting to unexpected situations.
When Hasdrubal saw that he was facing a larger Roman force than he had expected, when he noticed fresh Roman troops that should not have been there, he realized something had gone wrong. He tried to disengage, to withdraw and regroup, perhaps to wait for Hannibal to arrive before giving battle. But the Romans pressed him. They forced the engagement, giving him no time to prepare properly, no opportunity to choose favorable ground or arrange his forces optimally. The battle was chaotic, desperate, nothing like the carefully orchestrated victories Hannibal had won. Hasdrubal fought bravely. He was in the thick of the fighting, trying to rally his troops, trying to hold the line together. But the Romans had the advantage now. More men, better position, the initiative. The Carthaginian army began to crumble. When Hasdrubal saw that the battle was lost, that his army was breaking apart around him, he made a choice. He was a Barca. He would not be captured, would not be paraded through Rome in chains, would not give the Romans that satisfaction. He spurred his horse forward, straight into the thickest part of the Roman lines, fighting until he was cut down. It was a brave death, perhaps even a noble one, but it was still a death, and it meant the end of Carthaginian hopes in northern Italy. Without Hasdrubal, his army disintegrated. Many were killed, others captured, the rest scattered. The Romans celebrated their victory, but they understood that the real significance of the battle was not the defeat of Hasdrubal's army, but the prevention of his joining with Hannibal. That strategic goal achieved, they turned their attention to how best to communicate their success. And they chose a method that was brutal even by the standards of ancient warfare. They took Hasdrubal's head, preserved it, and sent it south. A Roman cavalry detachment rode to Hannibal's camp, waited until nightfall, and then hurled the head into the Carthaginian lines. Along with it came a message. Hasdrubal was dead, his army destroyed, no reinforcements would be coming. Imagine Hannibal's reaction when his soldiers brought him his brother's severed head. This was not just a military setback, though it was certainly that. This was personal. This was family. Hasdrubal had been more than just another Carthaginian general. He had been Hannibal's brother, someone who had shared his childhood, who had grown up under their father's teaching, who understood what drove Hannibal, what haunted him. The ancient sources tell us that Hannibal, upon seeing his brother's head, declared that he now saw clearly the fate of Carthage. It was a moment of profound realization. He had spent 11 years in Italy, won every battle, proven himself the greatest tactical commander of his age, and it had not been enough. Rome endured, Rome adapted, Rome learned, and now Rome was winning. The death of Hasdrubal at the Retaurus was the turning point of the war. Not the most dramatic moment, that had been CANNAE. Not the bloodiest battle, many engagements had cost more lives. But the moment when the trajectory of the war became clear, when the slow Roman recovery became an inexorable advance. After the Metaurus, Hannibal's position in Italy became increasingly untenable. He withdrew to the far south, to Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot. There he held a defensive position, still dangerous to any Roman force that directly attacked him, but no longer able to threaten Rome's heartland, no longer able to break the Italian Confederation.
And in Iberia, Publius Cornelius Scipio, young Scipio, the son of the man Hannibal had wounded at Ticinus, was completing the destruction of Carthaginian power. City by city, battle by battle, Scipio reclaimed Iberia for Rome. He was using Hannibal's own tactics against the Carthaginians, employing maneuver and surprise, combining different types of troops effectively, winning victory after victory. By 206 BCE, Carthage had lost Iberia entirely. The silver mines that had funded their war effort, the territory that Hamilcar and Hannibal had spent years securing, were now Roman. It was a devastating blow to Carthaginian resources and morale. The Roman reconquest of Italy proceeded methodically. Cities that had defected to Hannibal after CANNAE were retaken one by one. The punishments were severe, leaders executed, populations enslaved or relocated, property confiscated. Rome was making clear the price of betrayal, ensuring that future generations would remember what happened to those who sided against Rome. Hannibal could do nothing to prevent this. Trapped in Bruttium with a shrinking army, he could only watch as his Italian allies were crushed, as Rome reasserted control over the peninsula, as the fruits of his years of effort withered on the vine. He remained formidable even in these reduced circumstances. When Roman commanders grew overconfident and attacked him directly, he still won victories. In 203 BCE, he defeated a Roman army at Croton, demonstrating that his tactical genius had not diminished with age or circumstance. But these were defensive victories, holding actions, not the kind of aggressive campaigns that could change the strategic picture. And then Scipio proposed something audacious. Rather than continuing to fight Hannibal in Italy, where he remained dangerous, why not attack Carthage directly? Force the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal to defend their homeland. Bring the war to Africa, where Roman legions could fight on their own terms without the interference of Italian terrain and allies. It was a brilliant strategic insight, the kind of thinking that showed Scipio had learned not just Hannibal's tactical methods, but his strategic boldness. The Roman Senate, after some debate, approved the plan. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed in Africa with a Roman army. He began ravaging the Carthaginian countryside, defeating Carthaginian armies, threatening the city itself. The Carthaginian government, which had left Hannibal to fight unsupported in Italy for years, now panicked. They sent urgent messages to Hannibal: "Come home, defend Carthage. The war has come to us."
For Hannibal, the recall must have been bitter. He had spent 15 years in Italy, 15 years of campaigning, of victories and frustrations, of brilliant tactics and strategic disappointments. He had grown from a young man into middle age in this hostile land.
Many of his soldiers had been born in Italy, had never seen Carthage or Africa, and now he was being recalled, not in triumph, but in desperation. Not because he had won, but because Carthage was losing. He was leaving Italy not because he had achieved his objectives, but because his homeland needed him to defend it from the very enemy he had crossed the Alps to destroy. In the autumn of 203 BCE, Hannibal evacuated his army from Bruttium. He gathered his remaining soldiers, his veterans who had survived 15 years of warfare, and they boarded ships for Africa. As they sailed away from the Italian coast, Hannibal allegedly looked back at the land where he had spent so much of his life and wept. Whether from frustration, from grief, from exhaustion, we cannot know. Perhaps all three. He had come to Italy as a conqueror and was leaving as a recalled general. He had won every major battle except the one that mattered, the battle for Rome's ultimate defeat. The mountains he had crossed, the victories he had won, the years he had endured, all of it had led to this moment of departure, of retreat, of acknowledgement that his great gamble had failed. But the war was not over. One final battle remained, one last confrontation between Hannibal and Rome, not in Italy, but in Africa, not against anonymous Roman consuls, but against Scipio, the man who had studied Hannibal's methods, who had learned from his tactics, who had risen to prominence specifically to counter the Carthaginian threat. The student would face the master. The young Roman general who had trained specifically to defeat Hannibal would finally meet him in battle. And the fate of Carthage, of Rome, of the entire Western Mediterranean would be decided on African soil. The tide had turned. Rome, which had seemed on the verge of destruction after CANNAE, was now the aggressor. Carthage, which had been the offensive power prosecuting the war, was now defending its homeland. Hannibal, the invader who had terrorized Italy for 15 years, was now the defender, forced to fight on his home ground against an enemy who had learned too well from his example. The end was approaching. But Hannibal would not surrender, would not quit, would not accept defeat without one final effort to save his city and prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. One more battle, one more chance, one final confrontation that would echo through history.
Hannibal had not seen Carthage in 35 years. He had left as a boy of 9, following his father to Iberia. Now he returned as a man of 45, weathered by decades of war, carrying the weight of victories and disappointments, of brilliance and failure, of a life spent in pursuit of a single consuming goal. The city must have seemed both familiar and strange. The harbors were still magnificent, the temples still grand, the walls still imposing. But Hannibal himself had changed so much that perhaps the city felt like a place from a dream, a memory that did not quite match the reality before his eyes. The political situation in Carthage was complex. There were factions that supported continued war, others that wanted peace at almost any price. The Barcid faction, once dominant, had been weakened by years of inconclusive conflict and the loss of Iberia. Hannibal's return gave the war party renewed hope, but it also meant taking responsibility for a strategic situation that had deteriorated badly. Scipio was in Africa with a powerful Roman army, winning victories, gathering allies from among the Numidian tribes that had once supported Carthage. King Massinissa, a Numidian ruler who had fought for Carthage in Iberia but had been won over by Scipio, now provided Rome with the kind of excellent cavalry that had once been Hannibal's advantage. Peace negotiations began, but they were fragile, uncertain. Neither side fully trusted the other. And when a Roman supply convoy was attacked by Carthaginian forces, whether by accident or design is unclear, the tentative peace collapsed. War would continue, and Hannibal would have to face Scipio in battle. The two commanders met before the battle, according to legend. It was a conference between enemies who respected each other, perhaps the only two men in the Mediterranean who truly understood what the other had accomplished. They spoke in Greek,
the lingua franca of the educated classes, and discussed terms for ending the war without further bloodshed. We don't know exactly what was said. The ancient historians provide different versions, probably embellished or invented entirely. But the meeting itself likely happened, and it accomplished nothing. Neither commander could offer terms the other could accept. Hannibal could not surrender Carthage's independence or pay the kind of indemnity Rome would demand. Scipio could not return to Rome without a decisive victory. They parted, each returning to his army, each knowing that only battle would resolve the question. The armies met near a town called ZAMA, about 5 days' march southwest of Carthage in October of 202 BCE. It was, in its way, fitting. The greatest tactical general of the age, facing an opponent who had studied his methods, learned his tricks, and adapted them for Rome's purposes. Hannibal's army was not the force that had crossed the Alps or won at CANNAE. Many of his soldiers were new recruits, Carthaginian citizens and North African levies who lacked the experience of his Italian veterans. He did have some veterans with him, men who had survived the 15 years in Italy, but they were a minority, aging warriors whose best years were behind them.
He also had elephants, 80 of them, an enormous herd compared to the handful that had survived the Alpine crossing. These elephants were meant to be his shock troops, breaking the Roman lines before the main battle was joined. Scipio's army was larger, perhaps 40,000 men to Hannibal's 35,000. But the real Roman advantage was the cavalry. Maecenas' Numidians, the same kind of cavalry that had won Hannibal so many victories in Italy, now fought for Rome. Scipio had more and better cavalry than Hannibal did, a reversal of fortunes that must have been deeply frustrating for the Carthaginian commander. The battle began with the elephants. Hannibal sent them forward in a massive charge, hoping to disrupt the Roman formation as elephants had disrupted so many armies before. But Scipio had prepared for this. He had arranged his infantry in columns with gaps between them, creating lanes through which the elephants could pass. When the elephants charged, Roman horns and trumpets blared, creating a cacophony of noise that frightened and disoriented the beasts. Some of the elephants panicked and turned back, trampling Carthaginian cavalry in their retreat. Others ran forward through the lanes Scipio had created, passing through the Roman army without causing significant damage. Roman light infantry harassed them from the sides, wounding them with javelins, driving them away from the main formation. The elephant charge, which should have been devastating, accomplished almost nothing. It was the first sign that this battle would not go as Hannibal had planned. The cavalry engagement came next. On both wings, Roman and Numidian cavalry clashed with Hannibal's horsemen. But Hannibal's cavalry was outnumbered and outmatched. They fought as well as they could, but they were driven from the field, pursued by victorious Roman cavalry who chased them far from the battlefield. This was exactly what had happened to Roman cavalry at CANNAE, at Trebia, at so many of Hannibal's victories. But now the roles were reversed. It was Hannibal's cavalry fleeing, Hannibal's army left without mobile support, Hannibal facing the prospect of encirclement that he had inflicted on so many enemies. The infantry battle was fierce and prolonged. Hannibal's front line, his newer recruits, clashed with Scipio's legionnaires. They fought desperately, knowing that defeat meant the end of Carthage, but they were less experienced, less well-trained than the Roman soldiers. Slowly, they were pushed back, beginning to break. Hannibal did not commit his veterans immediately. He held them in reserve, watching the battle develop, looking for the moment to strike decisively. It was sound tactics. Use your weakest troops to wear down the enemy, then commit your best forces when they can be most effective. But Scipio understood what Hannibal was doing. He regrouped his own forces, reformed his lines, and prepared to face the Carthaginian veterans. When Hannibal finally committed his Italian survivors, those weathered soldiers who had fought from the Trebia to CANNAE to the long years in southern Italy, they met Roman legionaries who were fresh, organized, and ready. The fighting was brutal. These were the best troops on both sides. Hannibal's veterans with their years of experience, Scipio's legionaries with their discipline and training. Neither side would yield easily. The battle ground on, men fighting and dying in the dust and heat of the North African sun.
And then, at the critical moment, Scipio's cavalry returned. They had pursued Hannibal's cavalry off the field, ensuring they could not regroup and return. Now, having completed that task, they circled back to the main battle and charged into the rear of Hannibal's army. It was CANNAE in reverse. The double envelopment that Hannibal had perfected, that had destroyed so many Roman armies, was now being used against him. His infantry, attacked from front and rear, began to crumble. Units broke and fled. Others fought on, surrounded, until they were cut down where they stood. Hannibal's veterans, those men who had followed him for decades, who had never lost a battle under his command, died in their thousands. They fought to the last, refusing to surrender, honoring the tradition of the Carthaginian army even as it was being destroyed around them. Hannibal himself survived. Whether by deliberate choice or the chaos of battle, he managed to escape the carnage. Some sources suggest he left the field before the final collapse, recognizing that the battle was lost and that his death would serve no purpose. Others imply he fought until the end and only fled when there was no other choice. However it happened, Hannibal lived while his army died. 20,000 Carthaginian soldiers were killed at Zama. Thousands more were captured. It was a complete, devastating defeat. The first time Hannibal had ever truly lost a battle, and it came at the worst possible moment, in the war's final confrontation. Scipio had done what no Roman general had managed in 15 years of Italian campaigning. He had beaten Hannibal. Not through lucky circumstance or overwhelming numbers, but through tactical acumen, through understanding Hannibal's methods and developing effective counterattactics, through being a worthy opponent who had learned from the master and then surpassed him. After Zama, there was no hope left. Carthage sued for peace, and the terms were harsh. Carthage would surrender all territories outside Africa. They would hand over their fleet, all but 10 ships, ensuring they could never again threaten Roman naval supremacy. They would pay an enormous indemnity, 10,000 talents over 50 years, a sum that would keep Carthage impoverished and dependent for generations. They would surrender all war elephants and promise never to train more. They would not wage war outside Africa without Roman permission, and even within Africa only with Rome's consent. They would hand over hostages, including members of noble families, to ensure compliance. And Hannibal, there was debate about whether he should be surrendered to Rome, handed over to face whatever punishment the Senate devised. But ultimately, he was not included in the peace terms. Whether because Scipio respected him too much to demand his surrender, or because the political situation in Carthage made it impossible, Hannibal remained free. But free to do what? Carthage was defeated, prostrate, forced to accept whatever terms Rome dictated. The cause Hannibal had fought for his entire life was lost. His father's dream of Carthaginian power to rival Rome's was finished. The oath he had sworn as a 9-year-old boy, promising eternal enmity to Rome, had led to this. His homeland defeated, his city humbled, his life's work undone.
He was 45 years old. He had spent 35 years at war, his entire adult life and most of his childhood. He had won some of the most brilliant victories in military history. He had been feared by the greatest power in the Mediterranean. He had proven himself a genius of warfare, a leader who could inspire absolute loyalty, a strategist who could accomplish the impossible. And he had lost. Not because he lacked ability, not because he made catastrophic mistakes, but because Rome was simply too large, too resilient, too stubborn to be defeated by military genius alone. They could lose 50,000 men at CANNAE and raise new armies. They could endure 15 years of devastation in Italy and emerge stronger. They could learn from their defeats and adapt their tactics. They could produce their own brilliant generals who studied Hannibal's methods and turned them against him. As Hannibal rode back to Carthage after Zama, as he contemplated the peace terms his city would have to accept, did he think about what might have been? Did he wonder if marching on Rome after CANNAE would have made a difference? Did he regret the years spent waiting for reinforcements that never came, for support from Carthage that arrived too little and too late? Or did he simply accept that he had done everything a human could do, that he had fought as well as anyone could fight, and that sometimes brilliance and determination are not enough? The Second Punic War was over. Hannibal had lost, Rome had won, but both sides had been forever changed by the conflict, and the world would never be the same. For Hannibal, a new chapter was beginning. Not the chapter he would have chosen, not the triumph he had dreamed of, but the chapter he would have to live nonetheless. The warrior would have to become something else. The destroyer of Roman armies would have to find a new purpose. But that story, too, would prove more complex and more tragic than anyone might have expected.
After Zama, Hannibal did not fade into obscurity. He was still Hannibal Barca, still the most famous man in Carthage, still carrying the weight of the Barcid name and legacy. And Carthage, defeated and impoverished, needed capable leadership to navigate its humiliating new circumstances. In 196 BCE, 7 years after Zama, Hannibal was elected suffet, essentially the chief magistrate of Carthage, a civilian position equivalent to a consul in Rome. It was a remarkable political comeback for a general who had lost the Great War, a testament to his continued respect among the Carthaginian people and his reputation for competence and integrity. As suffet, Hannibal turned his formidable intellect from military matters to civil administration. What he found appalled him. Carthage's government was riddled with corruption. The wealthy oligarchs who controlled the city's finances were embezzling the funds meant to pay Rome's indemnity, forcing the burden onto the common people through excessive taxation. The same incompetence and self-interest that had left Hannibal unsupported during his Italian campaign were now bleeding the city dry in peacetime. Hannibal set about reforming the system with the same ruthless efficiency he had once applied to military campaigns. He restructured the tax collection system, eliminated corrupt officials, exposed the embezzlement schemes of the wealthy elite, and redirected funds toward paying Rome's indemnity while reducing the tax burden on ordinary citizens. His reforms were effective, perhaps too effective. The corrupt oligarchs whom he had targeted did not accept their loss of power and profit gracefully. They had powerful friends, extensive networks, and they began plotting against Hannibal. If they could not defeat him politically in Carthage, perhaps they could use Rome to destroy him. They sent messages to Rome claiming that Hannibal was plotting a new war, that he was in secret communication with Antiochus III, the Seleucid king who ruled much of the eastern Mediterranean and who himself was in growing tension with Rome. The accusations were probably false. Hannibal, whatever his feelings about Rome, was too intelligent to think Carthage could fight another war so soon after such a devastating defeat. But Rome believed the accusations, or at least found them convenient to believe. Perhaps they genuinely feared that Hannibal might find a way to threaten them again. Perhaps they simply could not tolerate the idea of Hannibal holding power in Carthage, even civilian power. A Roman delegation was sent to Carthage, ostensibly to investigate these charges, but really to demand Hannibal's extradition. Hannibal learned of the Roman delegation before they arrived. He understood what it meant. Rome would not be satisfied until he was in chains, paraded through their streets, humiliated, and probably executed. He had seen what Romans did to defeated enemies. He would not give them that satisfaction. In 195 BCE, at the age of 51, Hannibal fled Carthage. He left in secret.
in the night, abandoning his position, his home, everything he had known. It must have been a bitter moment, driven from his own city not by military defeat but by political intrigue, forced into exile not by Roman legions but by Carthaginian oligarchs who cared more for their wealth than for the man who had fought for their city. He sailed east, toward the kingdoms of the Hellenistic world, those successor states carved from Alexander the Great's empire. He was seeking a new patron, a new opportunity to continue his struggle against Rome, or perhaps simply a safe place to live out his remaining years. He found temporary refuge with Antiochus III, the Seleucid king. Antiochus was impressed by Hannibal's reputation and welcomed him to his court. For a few years, Hannibal served as an advisor to the Seleucid king, offering his expertise on military matters, on strategy, on how to deal with Rome's growing power. But Antiochus did not truly listen to him. When war finally came between the Seleucid Empire and Rome, a conflict sparked by Antiochus's expansion into Greece, the king gave Hannibal only minor commands, perhaps fearing that using him too prominently would further enrage Rome, perhaps doubting that a general who had ultimately lost to Rome could defeat them now.
Hannibal fought in a naval battle, commanding a Seleucid fleet against Roman allied forces near the coast of Asia Minor. It was strange, perhaps even humiliating, for the man who had crossed the Alps with elephants to now be fighting at sea, in the one kind of warfare where he had no particular expertise. The battle was lost, and Hannibal's role in it was marginal. When Antiochus himself was decisively defeated by Rome at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, one of Rome's conditions for peace was predictable. Antiochus must surrender Hannibal to Roman custody. The Seleucid king, defeated and desperate, agreed to the terms. Once again, Hannibal had to flee. He was now in his late 50s, aging, tired, moving from court to court in the eastern Mediterranean, always one step ahead of Roman agents who tracked his movements, always seeking the next ruler who might offer him protection. He went to Crete for a time, living quietly, trying to be inconspicuous. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that he hid his money in jars in a temple, making a great show of it, while his actual wealth was hidden inside hollow statues nearby. When thieves inevitably broke into the temple and stole the jars, finding them filled with lead, his real money remained safe. The story may not be true, but it illustrates how Hannibal was remembered. Always clever, always thinking several steps ahead, never quite what he appeared to be. From Crete, he moved to Armenia, then to Bithynia, a small kingdom in northwestern Asia Minor on the shores of the Black Sea. King Prusias of Bithynia welcomed him, employed him as a military advisor. Hannibal helped Prusias in his wars against neighboring kingdoms, winning some minor victories, still demonstrating flashes of his old genius even in these reduced circumstances. But Rome never stopped looking for him. Roman ambassadors appeared at courts throughout the East, asking about Hannibal, demanding his surrender, threatening consequences for any king who harbored him. It was as if Rome could not rest while Hannibal lived, as if the man who had brought them so close to destruction had to be eliminated completely before they could feel truly secure. The years passed. Hannibal aged. He was in his 60s now, far from home, living on the charity of foreign kings, moving from place to place like a fugitive. The man who had commanded armies, who had terrorized Rome, who had won CANNAE and crossed the Alps, was reduced to this: a wanderer, an exile, a remnant of a war that the world was beginning to forget. Did he think about his father during these years? Did he remember the oath he had sworn as a child, the promise of eternal enmity to Rome? He had kept that oath, had fought Rome with everything he had made them suffer as no enemy had ever made them suffer. But Rome had won anyway, and now they hunted him still, unwilling to let him die in peace. He must have been tired. Tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of depending on the uncertain hospitality of Eastern kings who valued him more for his famous name than for any real contribution he could still make. He was living in the past, or perhaps living in the shadow of his past,
unable to escape the legend he had created, unable to become anything other than Hannibal, Rome's great enemy. In Bithynia, he lived in a fortified house that King Prusias had given him. It was a comfortable prison in its way, safe from casual threats, but also isolated, cut off from the world. Hannibal had apparently prepared for the worst. The house had multiple secret exits, different ways to flee if enemies came. He was still thinking tactically, still planning his escapes, still the soldier who always had a backup plan. But eventually, there would be no more escapes. Eventually, Rome's reach would extend even here, to this distant corner of the Mediterranean, to this small kingdom on the shores of the Black Sea. Eventually, the chase would end. And when it did, Hannibal would have one final choice to make, one last act of defiance, one ultimate refusal to give Rome what they wanted. But we are not there yet. For now, in these final years before the end, Hannibal simply lived. He watched the sun rise over the Black Sea. He remembered Africa and Iberia and Italy and all the places he had been, all the battles he had fought, all the men who had followed him into legend. He was 64 years old, or perhaps 65. The ancient sources disagree, as they so often do. An old man by the standards of his time, worn down by decades of war and exile and constant flight. But still Hannibal, still the man who had crossed the Alps, who had won CANNAE, who had made Rome tremble. Still dangerous, still remembered, still, in some essential way, undefeated. But his time was running out.
The year was 183 BCE, or perhaps 182 or 81. The ancient sources differ on the exact date, as they do about so many things. But the year matters less than what happened, than how it ended, than the choice Hannibal made when there were no choices left. Roman ambassadors arrived in Bithynia. They came ostensibly on diplomatic business, to discuss some matter with King Prusias, but everyone knew why they were really there. They had come for Hannibal. After decades of pursuit, after following him from Carthage to Syria to Crete to Armenia to Bithynia, Rome had finally cornered its greatest enemy. Prusias was in a difficult position. He had harbored Hannibal for years, had benefited from his advice, had respected his abilities. But Rome was powerful, and Bithynia was small, and the pressure being applied was immense. The king wavered. He did not want to betray his guest, but he also did not want to face Rome's wrath. Hannibal understood before Prusias made any official decision. He had been reading the signs, watching the diplomatic maneuvering, seeing the way the king's advisors looked at him with a mixture of pity and calculation. He knew how this would end. Prusias would give him up, or Roman soldiers would come for him directly, and either way he would be captured. He had prepared for this moment. Years ago, perhaps decades ago, he had decided that he would never allow himself to be taken alive by Rome. He would not be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, would not be displayed as a trophy, would not give the Romans the satisfaction of seeing him humiliated and executed. He was a Barca. He would choose his own end. There are different versions of how he did it. Some sources say he carried poison in a ring, a hollow compartment that could be opened when needed. Others suggest it was hidden in the pommel of his sword, or in a small vial he kept on his person at all times. The exact method matters less than the fact that he had planned for this, had known that one day he might need a final escape, and had made sure it would be available. On the day the Roman agents came for him, Hannibal was in his fortified house in Bithynia. He heard them approaching, heard the sounds of soldiers surrounding the building, blocking the exits he had so carefully prepared. He realized, perhaps with grim amusement, that his tactical genius had finally met a situation where there was no clever maneuver, no unexpected move that would save him. The Romans, it seemed, had learned to be thorough. According to the historian Plutarch, Hannibal's final words were, "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." It was a final act of defiance, bitter and sardonic. Even in death, even in defeat, Hannibal would not give Rome what they wanted. They wanted to execute him publicly, to demonstrate their power, to close the book on the Second Punic War with a triumphal display. Instead, they would get only a corpse,
a man who had denied them even the satisfaction of punishment. He took the poison, whatever form it took, wherever he had hidden it, and died in that house in Bithynia, far from the land of his birth, far from the battlefields where he had won his glory, surrounded by Roman soldiers who arrived too late to take him alive.
He was approximately 64 years old. He had spent 55 years of his life in service to his oath, to the promise he had made as a 9-year-old boy, standing before an altar in Carthage, swearing eternal enmity to Rome. He had kept that oath to the very end, had never reconciled with Rome, had never accepted their supremacy, had never bowed before them. And, in the very last moment, he had denied them their victory over him. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was his. They could kill him, but they could not defeat him. Not really. Not in the way that mattered most. The news of Hannibal's death reached Rome and was met with mixed reactions. Relief, certainly. The man who had haunted Roman nightmares for a generation was finally gone. But perhaps also a strange sense of loss. Hannibal had been Rome's great adversary, the enemy who had tested them, who had forced them to become stronger, who had proven that they were not invincible and thereby made their eventual victory more meaningful. Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who had defeated Hannibal at Zama, was reportedly saddened by the news. He had respected Hannibal, had studied him, had learned from him. In some ways, Hannibal had made Scipio who he was. The student had surpassed the master, but he had never forgotten what the master had taught him. The exact location of Hannibal's burial is unknown. Some sources suggest he was buried in Bithynia, others that his body was later moved. There are multiple sites that claim to be his tomb, but none can be verified with certainty. In death, as in his final years of life, Hannibal remained elusive, impossible to pin down, more legend than concrete fact. But his legacy, that was undeniable, inescapable, eternal. Hannibal changed warfare. The tactics he developed, the strategies he employed, the way he combined different types of troops and used terrain and psychology and surprise, all of this became fundamental to military thinking. The double envelopment he perfected at CANNAE is still taught in military academies today. Modern generals still study his campaigns, still try to understand how he accomplished what he did with the resources he had. He changed Rome, too. The Second Punic War was the defining crisis of the Roman Republic, the moment when Rome could have been destroyed and chose instead to endure. The experience of fighting Hannibal, of suffering catastrophic defeats and continuing to fight, of adapting and learning and eventually prevailing, this shaped Rome's character, gave them a confidence and determination that would carry them to eventual domination of the entire Mediterranean. Without Hannibal, Rome might have remained just another Italian power, successful but limited. With Hannibal, Rome became something more, an empire that refused to accept defeat, that learned from its enemies, that could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other state and emerge stronger. And Hannibal himself became eternal. His name echoes through history. Parents in ancient Rome frightened their children with stories of Hannibal at the gates. Military commanders from Napoleon to Patton studied his tactics. Even now, more than 2,000 years after his death, people know his name, know that he crossed the Alps with elephants, know that he was one of the greatest generals who ever lived. He never conquered Rome. He never achieved the final victory his father had dreamed of, never broke the power that had humiliated Carthage. In the end, measured purely by outcomes, he failed. Carthage lost the war, paid the indemnity, was eventually destroyed entirely by Rome in a third and final conflict that came decades after Hannibal's death.
But failure is not the same as insignificance.
Hannibal's brilliance, his courage, his refusal to surrender even when all hope was gone, these things transcend victory and defeat. He fought the greatest power of his age and made them fear him. He won impossible victories. He kept an army loyal and effective for 15 years in hostile territory, far from home, with minimal support. He was, in the end, only human. He made mistakes, misjudged situations, failed to achieve objectives that might have been possible. But he was also magnificent, a genius of warfare who pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible and created moments of tactical perfection that still take our breath away more than 2 millennia later. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine Hannibal in those final moments in Bithynia. An old man, far from home, surrounded by enemies, taking poison rather than submit. Perhaps you can see him as a young man crossing the Alps, or standing before his father's altar swearing his oath, or surveying the field at CANNAE with the knowledge that he had just won the perfect battle. He lived an extraordinary life, full of triumph and tragedy, of brilliance and frustration, of unwavering commitment to a cause he believed in. He was defeated but never broken, hunted but never caught, remembered forever even though his city and his cause were destroyed. Rest now, as Hannibal finally rested after 64 years of struggle. The wars are over, the battles are done, the mountains have been crossed, the victories won and lost, the final choices made. Let the story of Hannibal Barca, the man who defied Rome, the general who crossed the Alps, the warrior who never surrendered, accompany you gently into your dreams.